hear me? Any sound in my microphone? You can hear me. Perfect. Sorry for being delayed 15 minutes. We had some technical problems. But we are all set. How many of you were in the woods yesterday? Okay. So you are in the Future Library vibe here. That's perfect. Welcome to the symposium here at Deichman Bjørvika. I lost my voice somewhere in the woods yesterday. I think this project leaves us all a bit speechless. But I will try to guide you through the day with this, with the voice I already have. The symposium you are attending is a collaboration between the Trust and Deichman. And we are also working with Lillehammer Litteraturfestival and Kunstnernes Hus on this symposium. So they are sharing ideas and thoughts, and that is wonderful to make a day like this. My name is Merete Lie, and I'm the director of this main library. And I am also a brand new member of the board for the Future Library Trust. That is brand new. I'm following Liv Sæteren. Yes, she has done a great job for Deichman for many years. So I'm really happy to even dive further into the work. And since Scottish Katie Paterson established the Future Library in 2014, it has generated interest and engagement throughout the world. People get intrigued, they get excited, they get captivated. This year, the crowd in the woods yesterday was even bigger than I expected, and we expected a big crowd. And why does this project create this kind of interest? Why is it brought into a growing movement, getting a bit bigger each year? I suppose we all feel a sense of urgency, a necessity of changing course to come to grips with our massive and increasing sustainability and environmental impacts. It weighs heavy on our shoulders. We see it worldwide, you see it in your home countries, and we see it here in Norway. A steady decline in land area that is wilderness, a degraded or lost biodiversity and ecosystems that are affected by humans destroying nature. And I believe we do not fully understand nature and the importance of it. And our lack of understanding over years making ourselves alien to nature is the gloomy backdrop of the Future Library. That backdrop is at the same time producing the power this art project has and the hope it brings. The belief that future can bring something good, something that is worth waiting for 100 years from now, is part of the massive force Future Library generates. It affects us because this is something we really want to believe in, that in 100 years, the Future Library will be in landscapes where we might not be in a place just as good as we are today, but maybe even better as we see today. And talking about humans' relationship to nature is difficult because nature is everything. We are nature. But the Future Library talks about nature in a specific terms. It talks about the forest, it talks about wood, and it talks about the trees. And the forests are mysterious, majestic, proud, magical. A forest has a way of capturing our imagination. Dark and hauntingly beautiful, inspiring, and even scary. We are literally walking in the shadows of nature. And at the same time, trees and wood are something we have tried to manage for a long time, for centuries. We have cut down and sold wood. It has brought us prosperity. It has brought us paper, and we have made books from it. Some trees are there to sell and to make into paper. Some trees are there to climb. Some forests are there for a walk. And some forests are just so beautiful you want to stand still and stare at them and listen to them. And I think this is the fierce tension between the mythical, the majestic forest and the more practical way of seeing a forest that we people believe we can manage. We are in here in the tension between maintaining the forest and making the practical use of it. How can we admire and enjoy the forest? And how can we make practical use without destroying it and preserving the nature? So Future Library addresses this question. We are in the middle of preserving, not destroying, enjoying, trying to keep for the future. And I think that's the idea that both moves and touches us. And I think we all get a bit breathtaking or speechless, as I am almost, because we are part of a project that creates this belief that we humans can act in a way that is good for us and good for the next generations that are following us. That we can act in a way that we preserve nature, where we can restrain ourselves from taking and using everything we can. And like we enter a forest, we can enter a story told in a book. And the Future Library gives us faith that these two important parts of our lives, being able to enjoy nature, being able to enjoy literature, still will be a part of the future. That we can act in a way that's good, and that we will be around to produce stories and walk among the trees in 2114. And I believe that's the great force. We all feel the sense of urgency, and we all want to be a part of the hope that this beautiful project brings. And our relationship to nature, to deep time, to the closer past, and to the future. That are the topics we will touch upon today from different angles. And a few practical pieces of information. If you need a toilet, it's here on the ground floor. We will have lunch at 12 o'clock, and this symposium ends at 3 o'clock. I think this was a sort of a long way from the majestic forest to the toilets, but it took the magic around. Next time I will start with the toilets and end. Oh, I felt it fell right down. But anyway, we will, until we have a break, about 11:30, you will hear 2 lectures. And please write down questions you have, because we will enjoy discussions and questions during this seminar. It's 2 things that will happen before the break. You will meet Katie and Anne Beate talking about A Century Unfolds. And then you will hear the wonderful authors, David Mitchell and Sjón, here on the front row, interviewed by Robert Young. But first, to Century Unfolds. All of us here know about the Future Library project, but not all of you have had the pleasure of listening to Katie Paterson talk about her artwork. Katie holds a great fascination with nature, the universe, and deep time, the stretch of geologic history of billions of years. She has been preoccupied with these themes: nature, ecology, geology, and cosmology through her young but quite impressive career. And I must say, if you haven't seen her exhibition at F15 on Jeløya, it's a wonderful place to visit. I recommend it. And there you will see that Katie holds a true genius for capturing big ideas into projects like we are here and discuss today. And I would say that Katie was quite lucky to find Anne Beate Hovind when it came to the Future Library. It is quite an amazing project. Hello, we need a forest, we need a silent room, we need 100 years, we need 100 authors, we need authors that can write books that no one will read before in 100 years. It's grand ideas. And she was lucky to run into Anne Beate, who is the chairman of the board. And she has an eagerness and an energy that has been of major importance to this project. All practical, emotional parts of the project is well taken care of by Anne Beate. So please welcome Anne Beate and Katie.
We only have 15 minutes, that's what we're worrying about. But we're late, but we will try to be within 15 minutes for sure. Please give us the signals. 10:26. That's great. A century unfolds.
Morning.
Katie. It's the title, and but it's already been a decade. It's been more than 2014, actually. And our ambition for these 50 minutes is to do kind of a recap of what happened yesterday, since not all of you were there, very short, but also to talk about how it all started and go through some of Katie's other artworks. Yesterday, we were all in the forest. It is a ritual that we will take on every year until 2114. And then, even though it differs from year to year, since there are different authors, we have that harp, and Sjón, who was here, we had a harp in the forest. That was quite difficult, actually, to get that in there. And David had a different proposal, and the same this year. So it differs from year to year, but the whole thing is that it's a very strict concept of the work. And I must say, I'm amazed how we're able to stick to that. And it's the original idea from Katie and how she presented it. So that's my only mission, is to stay on that strict understanding of what is the work, because there are lots of things that can be added on. So yesterday we gathered, as we do, and we walked the footsteps of us and previous authors, like we do here in the forest. And in the forest, this year there were 2 authors, and that's where they hand over the manuscript they've written. And we had 2 authors, Karl-Ove Knausgård and Tsitsi Dangarembga, this year. And what was very special about this year was, of course, something that I took, actually. Here. A contract for 100 years. I will come back to that a little bit, because people think, haven't you had a contract? No, you haven't, until now. That took a decade to get, actually. And of course, what was also a big event yesterday was opening of the silent room, and all the authors present was invited to. They were all invited to come back, so they were here for putting their own manuscript into the room. And now it's going to be available publicly in the opening hours of the library until 2114. I'm very worried. It is like giving birth to a child, and I don't know what's going to happen to it. I think she's going to grow, and she will change, I'm sure, and that's going to be fine. It's going to be okay. But it's really an act of trust to let this go now, and let trust in the public and the people to use it the coming years. So you heard me say this, so when things are happening, I saw the fire truck outside. It came to my mind immediately. Oh well, this is part of the work. But Katie, this is also the room. And this was also from the hand of yesterday. So, but we all know this now. This was just a short recap. But Katie, how did it all start?
I'm holding this in my hand. This is, can you hear me? Is it okay? This is a very small object, but which contains around 150 or so ideas of artworks to either exist entirely in your imagination, or some are realized, some are unrealized, most are unrealized. And everything starts for me with a blank page and a pen or a pencil. And I write a load of gibberish that only I can get something from, but then I kind of distill things and see connections between things. And through a process of writing, I have ideas, and then they sometimes come together in a book. They're like prose poems, maybe, and they're really often on the brink of complete impossibility. Some completely impossible, but a lot of them are on that borderline between, will this ever come off the page, or will it stay as, you know, something to exist in only in your imagination? So in this book, we've got Future Library, and so it began as a forest of unread books growing for a century. So that idea has been there for some time, and I got invited to Norway.
So that's part of the story, that I represent the commissioner.
Yeah.
So we looked for artists that could fit our kind of curatorial vision, which was to create a slow space for people in this harbor development where you are now. That was the only brief, actually, for the artists. We were inviting them back to come to Oslo, and then to think of slow space and to be able to offer that to people. It turned out to an urban farm with a bakehouse that you can visit afterwards if you like. It's just 10 minutes walk, and Katie's work.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't that easy.
No, it wasn't that easy.
It had to get off the book.
It did feel like like Merete Lie said, I ran into you. How lucky was that? Yeah, I invited to Oslo. We were having these beautiful meetings in the forest, allotments, opera roof, and somehow this memory of this little scrap of paper that I'd written, and I'd been drawing tree rings, and I just visually seen a connection to chapters. I mean, I just saw tree rings, chapters, book, and how I saw a library as a forest and a forest as a library, and saw, how books, they have this whole past life, What tree has this book come from, what forests have all of these books come from? But the thing is that when I have these ideas, it's me in this little moment, but I find it really hard to visualize the actual form of the thing. So we'd been in Norway. We'd met each other. I'd sort of thought, oh my God, remember that funny idea that I'd put in my pocket a long time ago, and thought, there's no way, who is gonna pick this one up? And then I got home to Berlin, and I called you almost immediately. I said, Anne Beate, I need to go to a forest, now if possible. And so, yeah, you set me up. You said, of course, come.
People in Norway have cabins in forests. I think all of us. And I come from the Eastern District towards Sweden. It's the deepest forest, It's famous for 70 kilometers forest. That's the name of the forest. Halfway, 4 kilometers off the road, there is a sæter. It's a small farm. And I brought her there and left her there. And then, for a week.
Yeah, no electricity, no running water.
That's how it is.
Amazing. It was completely amazing. And so, yeah, I just needed to be amongst the trees to really try and make something that's very, very immaterial, which is still very immaterial in many ways, but to try to visualize it as a real growing thing. And so, yeah, I stayed in there for a week, maybe longer. Your last words were, watch out for the bears and the wolves. I was just like, oh my God.
But I remember when you came out of the forest, you had met one person and you were terrified.
Yeah, the
you didn't
person.
expect to meet people. So
The person
the bear
scared me
see.
so much more than all the footprints and everything. But yeah, so I came out of the woods, And I said, okay, this is what I want to propose.
There's a lot of stories through when she presented 100 years. It's kind of panicking. I'm not going to go through all that, but because we can do that another time, because that will take a couple of hours to go through how everything happened. But what I want to now is to spend the rest of the time to look at some of your other works, just so that you get a broader image of what she's doing. And having this time in nature, and also if you can speak about, we have some images and we can run through it before we finalize, so that's the backdrop of the rest of the day from you.
Yeah.
And if you also think of how you always collaborate, I would say, with scientists. So let's start at this one work.
Vatnajökull, the sound of. I wish Sjón could say that for me.
You could. What is it? What
Vatnajökull, yeah. Thank you.
Glacier and Iceland.
I was a student, and I wanted to, it's in here, set up a live phone line to Glacier. So I did, after a long, complicated situation. I put a microphone deep inside the lagoon, and people could dial a phone number, and they could listen live to the sound of the glacier melting. So in a few words, it was a collapsing of distance and time. It was trying to create a connection, literally a phone connection, between something so vast and so ancient and so alive, but that yet you could kind of hear the sound of its demise. So it was a little bit melancholy, a little bit trying to come close to something that I felt terribly distant from, even when I was camping right there with the microphone.
So I have two questions. Did people call? And if they did any Norwegian call? Or Iceland?
Yeah, people called from all over the world. But they called especially from hot places, from deserts, in desert regions, because the sound of a glacier was alien.
Because when you say that, that's my experience with Future Library too, that growing up in a forest myself, it's almost hard to see that it's relevant to do this for people. We forget that there's lots of people that can't imagine a glacier melting, but we can, as we are so close to it, or melting snow. So I'm not surprised that people from deserts are calling, actually.
Yeah.
I would like to, can go through a couple of more works before we finish?
Yeah.
Fossil necklace.
Yeah. So a few things happened in between putting the glacier, and I learned a bit more about space and time, and worked with a whole lot of astronomers and people. And then, so this is a necklace. It's, if you get the chance to go to Moss, it's there, and it's carved out of fossils into small beads, and it charts the evolution of life effectively. It starts at a bead carved from the first single-celled life on Earth, and then it travels through this very, very deep geological time, through these very, very kind of vulnerable beads, and they're strung with silk on this necklace, and it kind of highlights moments like the first creatures to open their eyes is a bead, the first creatures to come out of the water and breathe, and the first flowers to create colour, all the major extinctions, all the moments that kind of led to us being alive and breathing right here, right now. So it's a real cycle of time, and it was a big collaborative effort to many paleontologists and fossil hunters and geologists, and
We have time for one more. I want to be concerned about time. This last one.
All the Dead Stars. It is a huge, heavy aluminium map that's got very delicate little spots, and every dot represents a star that has died somewhere in the universe. When I made it in 2009, there was 27,000 of these dead stars, and supernova, gamma ray burst, stellar black hole. I worked with 100 or more astronomers to, first define what a dead star is, and then to literally take every coordinate and map it as a huge ATOF projection. So for me, this was highly significant because it was the first time I really got to grips with the Earth being the kind of cosmic residue of space, that it didn't just appear, it's come from stars dying. It's come from this big, vast cosmic recycling system of other moons and other solar systems and galaxies colliding, and if these stars had not died in whatever position, however distant, however many billions of years ago, we would not be alive, And so it's trying to sense or kind of relativize these enormous expanses of time, which might feel so incredibly distant, that are actually totally within us, and alive in us, alive in our blood, alive in our, the fillings in our teeth. They've all come from a star dying, and so I think all the work in that way has all these different levels of time operating, from the billions of years to the 100 years, which is very short, and our relationship to that, which is always changing,
This was our 50 minutes, but can you just tell us, how did you engage people in this work?
Oh, I write letters. I mean, and we, my studio, there's a small team of us, but we write letters to people, and we've had so many amazing responses. I mean, because normally I'm asking people in very specific fields, somebody who's working with stellar black holes, or the trilobite expert who deals with the first trilobites that had eyes. Those are just two examples of hundreds and hundreds of examples, and they're so happy because somebody's interested in trilobites with eyes, and so they say, of course I want to help you. Yeah.
And what are you doing now?
Now I'm doing, I didn't put an image, but I'm doing a really big commission for Apple's headquarters in Silicon Valley, which is really amazing. And I'm making, I'm working with Labyrinths architects firm. We're collecting sand from every desert on Earth, and we're making it into glass, cast glass columns, 500, that are going to kind of move through desert landscapes, that are going to change from kind of greens and blues and clears, and from the iron content in the sand. So it's very almost not there because it's glass and you walk through it, but very heavy and kind of using really old techniques. People don't add wild sand to make glass now. It's all mined from mountains made of silica. So I'm going back to the first methods in Mesopotamia and other places that discovered glassmaking in the deserts. So we're mixing really modern methods of casting glass with these old
This
desert.
is when I get worried.
Yeah.
Logistical part of this.
Yeah, it's not easy, and I don't have 100 years this
No.
time. So, yeah.
Well,
November it's going to open, probably.
We just wanted to trigger your curiosity on Katie.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to read more about her from now. So thank you.
Thank you for listening, and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. Big ideas, not only ideas, but made into beautiful projects you can watch. Vertical Labyrinths, Rewriting Time. David Mitchell, Sjón, and Robert Young are about to enter the stage. Time travel, multiple historical periods, parallel stories running in the past, present, and future. Fiction and modern novel allow us to these perspectives. Two of our most inventive writers meet to discuss how they approach time in all its dimensions in their writing. British author David Mitchell, and you were the second Future Library author. Perfect. Celebrated Cloud Atlas was set in multiple realities across a span of thousands of years. But this is just one part of his gigantic fictional metaverse that connects all these novels through time and space. And Sjón, the third writer to the Future Library from Iceland, is an internationally acclaimed writer, working in various literary forms and in all genres of film. He's equally interested in exploring different time zones, including the strange, timeless zone of myth. What are the challenges in rethinking time in modern fiction? And what are the limits? Mitchell and Sjón will enjoy a conversation moderated by British Rob Young, also an award-winning writer and artist, and 5-year editor of The Wire. Please welcome them to stage.
Thanks very much for that intro. I'd love to have won an award, but I actually haven't. But I know it's one of those things that people say. I think the Guardian newspaper had this thing where if they were listing film and television listings, and there was a really bad film on the schedule, they had this thing where they would write the award-winning film in the blurb. Well, it's great. Welcome back to Oslo, to you both, David and Sjón. Great to have you here under the canopy of the Future Library project. And just hearing Katie there really struck me. Katie, if you'd been a musician, you'd totally be a prog rock musician. And we've been kind of thinking, the title that I chose for this talk, the Vertical Labyrinths, I realized it really sounds like a 70s prog rock album title. And in fact, it came up in conversation yesterday. David was suddenly talking a lot about the band Yes, which was who of course did who explored strange fictional universes through the medium of rambling prog rock. So we're going to go on a sort of ramble through ideas around time and fiction in this session. What I did originally want to do was just start with a couple of video clips just to kind of establish the mood, but because of the cruel and repressive rights issues, we're not allowed, and because we're streaming, we're not allowed to actually show videos, but I'll just describe a couple of the ones. One which really made an impression on me when I saw this film when I was probably about 11 years old was the 1960 adaptation of The Time Machine, which of course was the H.G. Wells novel published in 1895. There have been several versions of the novel, but it's a really amazing sort of conception, certainly for its time, of traveling through time. In a way, it set a template for this way of thinking about moving through time. It's basically a kind of a Victorian scientist has built this very steampunk chair with red velvet and lots of metal tubing and a big handle, and then there's a kind of dial with a date, the current date, which is in 1899, and he sits in the chair to try out this thing and just moves the handle very slowly, and through the window you see the sun just move a little bit quicker through the sky, and then he pushes a little bit more, and then the moon comes up and it goes dark, and he gets excited, so he pushes it much harder, and suddenly the cycle speeds up enough, and he looks out the window, there's a clothes shop across the road, and he sees the display dummies having all their clothes changed really fast through the seasons, pushes it even harder, and suddenly you whiz through the years and decades and centuries, and war destroys his house. At one point, a mountain seems to cover him up entirely and goes down again. And he ends up in this strange, almost a Garden of Eden type place where it's his final destination, where the story carries on. But it certainly made a huge impression on me watching that as a kid. It's as a sort of sense of the thrill and exhilaration of whizzing through time to sort of end up tens of thousands of years in the future. The other one I wanted to show is quite a well-known one from the 1999 film, The Matrix, that legendary moment which is known as the bullet time sequence, where you have an agent shooting a pistol at Keanu Reeves. And normally in a film, a gunshot takes no time. It's just an instant. It's basically a bang and a patch of blood. But in this, the journey of the bullet from the gun is completely slowed down. You see the bullet traveling through the air. The camera sort of spins around it as it goes. And Keanu has time to lean back and dodge the bullet. So, and also when I suggested these clips, also Sjón came back on email with a suggestion for another one that we could have thought about, which was the 1962 film La Jetée by Chris Marker. And Sjón, do you want to sort of just briefly describe the film and why you thought that was a good one to include?
So it's a time-traveling film, and it is a short film. It's, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable films ever made. It's a black and white film, only made by stills. So there is no actual filmed movement in the film. It's just made up of stills, you know, that line up for 26 minutes. And it's a story about a man in the future, after a great disaster, most likely a nuclear disaster, who is being sent back in time. They're doing experiments in the future to send people back in time. And it's at an early stage, so it's not like a complete mission. You're going back in time and you're going to correct this. They're just seeing how this works. And they're sending him back to time. And they're researching how it works. And he is searching for a moment to connect with in his past. And in the past before the disaster. And he finds a moment from his childhood when he's on a jetée, as they call it, the French. In the old days, the airports had like ramps. You went on the ramp, and then everything was open in the airports, as you know. I mean, you just walked into the airport and onto the plane, you know. And you just came, you might come running out of your taxi, and you ran through the airport and onto the plane.
Into the plane and light up a cigarette.
Yeah, and you lit, yeah. But so he has this memory as a child of being at the airport and noticing a woman standing there who looks like she's waiting for someone, and then there's a man who comes running, and the man is shot. So they're trying to find the way back to that moment, and that is what propels him back in time and to the time before the disaster. So this film came to mind because it is dealing with time travel. It's dealing with the deeply personal before a disaster as a way of connecting with a world that has been lost in a disaster. And we are writing for the future, so we are very much thinking about the future here. And it is possible, I'm sorry to say, that in 2114, when people read our works, they will be reading works that were written before the great disaster. Sadly, it's so. So, and what they will be connecting with through our works is deeply individual experiences from our times. So that's why it came to my mind. And also the fact that it is made up of stills. It's not made up of like a running film. It's made up of fragments. And maybe the past is made up of fragments. I mean, when we think about the past, it's not a running narration. We only have it in fragments.
And in a way that
new and old, yeah,
gives it perhaps a slightly more literary quality as well, as a sense of slowing down moments that you can contemplate a bit more. I mean, thinking about the whole idea of time, the sort of self-consciousness around time in literature. I mean, it seems to me it didn't really appear, these sort of stories that specifically focus on time really start to appear maybe around the height of the industrial age in the late 1800s, perhaps. I mean, the H.G. Wells story is a good example of that, coming in 1895. And perhaps that has something to do with the fact that human culture in that period is sort of speeding up in so many ways, in terms of the speed you can travel, the telegraph, that sort of collapse of time and distance through technology like never before. And I mean, certainly, David, when I think about, I mean, we're a similar age, and I certainly was very aware, kind of as a kid, of a lot of sort of stories, both in books and on TV, that had to do with time or time travel, or kids going back in time to sort of be in the court of Elizabeth I, or this kind of thing, or and sort of Doctor Who, one of the great British TV exports, who is a Time Lord and kind of travels around through the dimension of time. So I mean, and the title. Thinking back to the title of the book that you delivered to Future Library, the title was "From Me Flows What You Call Time." So we'll go a bit more into the way you've sort of explored time through your books. But I mean, is it fair to say that it's played quite a strong presence in the sort of formative years?
Yeah, for sure, Rob. I've got about 4 things in my head that I want to say at the same time, but I can't because we're stuck in
one dimension,
sequential time. Yeah. Well, 4 dimensions actually. Well, 5. But, so I'm just trying to get some sort of order. There is something wonderful. There is something wondrous. There is something that is full of wonder about thinking about time that I think children in particular have no immunity to because they haven't done it before. So when they encounter a time machine, oh my God, it's this miracle which perhaps kids these days they simply absorb more cultural products, more narratives, so maybe they're less impressionable than we were in the 80s, but it's as if you're a fish and you're being told that there's this thing called water for the first time, and it's what you live in. And the first time, that just blows your tiny little fish mind. So it was certainly in the ether. And I think, like all of us, I was highly susceptible to these stories. And the proof is in their popularity and their enduring relevance as cultural artifacts. I was also just thinking, why would you get 2 novelists up here to talk about time? What makes us such experts? I mean, we can't do the maths. Heaven knows we can't do the maths. We're not physicists. We're not cosmologists. Why us? and I was then trying to answer the question, and maybe it's because all we do is make narratives and world build. That's all we do. It's a big all and it's a small irrelevant all at the same time. When you make a world, you also have to endow it with time. So time is actually it's one of the tools of our trade, or it's one of the ingredients of the cakes we make. We can't make a narrative without a when to fit the narrative over and sort of in. So perhaps this is our one small justification for assaulting the good citizens of Oslo with our prognostications about time at this time on a Monday morning. And so I'm in the lazy habit of saying what we do is made of 5 things. It's plot, character, structure, style, and ideas. And then I was just thinking as you were speaking this morning, no, actually, no, heaven no, that's a 6th thing. It's time. We get to be the god of our little cosmologies. That's why it's such a fun job. For once in the world, we're important. And we get to accelerate it here, we get to stop it here, we get to flip it back. We have to work out the timeline. Otherwise, the narrative will feel rickety. Even if it's concealed, we have to know it. We have to know what order, what happens. We have to know the causality of our narratives. So, what I'm trying to do here is just to build a connection with a childhood fascination with time and narratives that deal with time, film, TV, books, and also actually the adult vocation. We have to kind of be a little bit of a Time Lord in a very shabby linen coat. Over. Thank you.
I mean, to think. I mean, when you say about doing the maths, I mean, just to sort of take specifically what's, I guess, possibly your best known novel, The Cloud Atlas.
It'll be on my tombstone.
It will.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But I mean, that's obviously a very sort of intricately constructed novel. It's kind of got about 5 different stories, sort of nestled inside each other. Is it 6? There you go, 6 books. Long time since I read it. Very complicated story, very forgettable, actually. But no, it's sort of several stories spanning a very wide stretch from sort of this historical novel aspects, the science fiction in the future, the stuff set more or less in the present, and they're all kind of nestled inside each other. Each story sort of opens out into the next. I mean, how conscious were you when you were beginning that you wanted to do this, and what can you give us an idea of the kind of plotting and planning and maths, if you like, that went into that, clock making, if you like?
Just briefly, I'm really eager to hear from my honourable Icelandic colleague here. However, like Katie, actually, it was just a little boop idea. What would it look like if you take Italo Calvino's "If on a Winter's Night a Traveller," which is a book where short stories are constantly being interrupted, and then a new one begins, and a new one begins, and a new one begins. And each one's quite addictive, and you want to know what happens next. It's like Scheherazada's 1001 Nights, but you never get the end of the tale. There's always a new tale. What would happen if you put a mirror there, and you actually did get the continuations in the order of a Russian doll? If you sort of think it's rather a grotesque image, but the narrative viewpoint is the tip of a drill bit that is going through a nest of the navels of a nest of Russian dolls. So that was just the idea. It was originally going to be 12, not 6, but I realised the book was going to be about 1,200 pages long, and life's too short. Just what would it look like? So that was the sort of fixed principle, and I can't say it was an easy book to write, but if that's the prime directive, then everything else falls into place, because I had to obey the prime directive, and that took a lot of the that answered a lot of the decisions for me. Art is a sequence of decisions, tiny little ones, like, do I use the word maybe or perhaps here, all the way to what's this thing about, and thousands, countless decisions you make, and the totality of those decisions is the novel, or the artwork, or the whatever, the symphony, the prog rock epic. It's all decisions and your answers. I'm getting off track here, sorry. And yeah, each narrative, but each narrative needed its own timeline, and there's a nestling of timelines from the past to the future and then to the past again in reverse order. To answer your question.
Yeah.
You and time.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to pick up on what you said about the strange fact that novelists are being asked to talk about time, and you started making the perfect excuses for us. But I think one of the things that the novel brings is dealing with time as humans experience it. So we have the sense that we are in a grand narrative. Wherever we are placed within a grand narrative. And that narrative is made up of the past, what is happening in the present, more or less dictated by what has happened in the past, if you believe in causality. And you're constantly at the moment where the future is arriving, if that is how you experience time. And so we are within this grand narrative, and we are in time. But when you're a novelist and you are writing about the human experience of your characters, then you have the unique possibility of doing whatever you want with time. Because you can be in the middle of a civil war with your character in the novel, and you decide to slow time to an experience that happens in a split second, but can only be written in 100 pages. And then you might say, you might come out of that split second and you could say 3 years passed. And you continue with the story. And this is what the novel does so beautifully. You can mold time to the experience of the character, and this is how we experience time as people. We all have that experience constantly. It's like, an afternoon was endless, and then 3 months go by and we feel, they've just rushed by, And actually we've just come out of a situation where time was completely messed up for us, where we were stuck in a repetitive existence, in the COVID lockdowns. And at the same time, so you felt like nothing was happening. You were just repeating the same thing. And all of a sudden, 4 weeks had passed, So this is what the novel recreates so beautifully. It is that we live many different experiences of time. That's why we are the experts on this.
I would say the novel is the expert on it. We get to drive the novel. The novel is really good at the... it has strengths and weaknesses.
Well, as the drivers, we are the current experts on it. We are driving it. So the next time you're on the bus, the expert of that journey is not the bus itself. Do you think so? Is it the bus itself? Or is it the driver? We trust the driver to be the expert of moving the thing.
One of the reasons I love my friend here is that I never quite know at what level of irony he's operating. Is he way up here? Or is it exactly, is he being completely literal? I don't always know. Oh, which gives our friendship an extra spice. The novel is rubbish at some things. It's rubbish at music. It's got no speakers in it. So Lord help you if you ever want to write a book about music, because, as opposed to making a film about music where you've got speakers, you can actually do it. A novel is really good on time and the paradoxes and its beauties. So beautiful. I could begin to do the beginning of the maths of Einstein's relativity work, but just to think about a room, and you're in the middle of the room, and there's a little lamp pull and a light bulb above you, and you can switch the lamp on by pulling on the string. And at either end of this long, narrow room are 2 doors, and these doors have a light-sensitive operating mechanism. So when a light wave hits them, the doors will flip open. And so just imagine yourself, and this is Einstein, not me, so I'm not taking the credit here, but in the long room, light bulb, the light waves move out and they hit the door at exactly the same moment. What happens? Of course, yes, the doors both flip open at the same moment. However, imagine that this long room is actually a train carriage. It's a segment of the train, and this train is, think of a Japanese bullet train. It's hurtling through the landscape, and you're not on the train now. You're outside it. You're on the bank, just watching this train go by. And at the moment that the little person on the inside pulls the cord, that is when the train passes you. So you and me, you pull the thing. Of course, when you're on the embankment watching the train, this end of the train is hurtling this way to meet the light wave, which is approaching it. It's going to meet it. Whereas the other end of the train, it's going, woo! The light wave has to chase that end to catch up. So if you're watching this same room on the embankment, what will happen? This door will open before this door. And it's the same damn room. So if you're inside, the doors open at the same time. If you're outside watching this train go by, the doors open at a different time. How beautiful is that? Isn't that one of those beautiful things you ever heard? The novel's really damn good at this. It can do this sort of thing really well. It's words. That wasn't a particularly eloquent summation of that part of the theory, but I got the idea over. A novelist with half an afternoon would make a much better job of it. But yeah, the printed word's amazing at this. So this is why I was being a little pedantic, saying it's the novel that's the expert, and we are bus drivers of varying skills who drives the novel. Over.
I think what something that both of your sort of output has in common is that you've both written works set in very diverse time zones. You've both written a lot of what you could call historical novels, and I'm sort of curious about what leads you to situate work in particular time zones. Sjón, in particular, what strikes me about your work is that while you set work in specific historical moments, you often throw in details that seem to throw those moments into question in a certain way. I mean, it can be. I'm thinking of, for example, in Moonstone, one of your more recent novels, you have a character who almost seems like it's a sort of a female leather-jacketed motorbiker almost that seems to have stepped out of Easy Rider or something like that. You have in The Whispering Muse, you have it's set on a ship in 1949, but there's a second mate who seems to have stepped off the mythical ship, the Argo. I mean, I'm assuming it's sort of you're having fun with these sort of, and I'm been looking forward to using this wonderful word, chronoclasm. A chronoclasm, which is an example of something where something from a different time zone pops up in the wrong time zone. Oh, lovely expression.
You sexy beast.
Thank you. Right.
Definitely in The Whispering Muse, you have like different times coming together. In Moonstone, the girl Sola, in her leather outfit, riding her red motorbike in 1918, is a historical possibility.
Sure, but it's quite exotic nevertheless.
Yeah, but for people who don't know that girls dressed all in leather and rode red motorbikes in 1918, it is like, wow, where does this come from? It comes from 1918, when girls were riding motorbikes in all leather outfits. But in The Whispering Muse, you have a character who is like a time traveler. I mean, like you say, it takes place in 1949, actually in a fjord here in Norway. And this second mate, he claims to have been on the great ship Argo with Jason. And he takes us into mythical time, you know. He exists in mythical time. And in mythical time, in the mythical space, let's say, then time as we know it doesn't exist or is just one possibility. So if you are a mythical figure from 3000 BC, you can easily appear on a ship in Norway in 1949. And this is maybe like, you know, one way of looking at it is to look at it as a metaphor for how times, all recognizable times or times that have left a trace, you know, they will keep existing alongside the times that follow. So so Kenneth, this character, he is just nobody aboard the ship. And at the end, actually, we learn that the rest of the crew also comes from mythical times, and the ship is a sort of a time machine that they have to like wind up at the end of the tale to continue and go on to new adventures. No one seems to be surprised that this guy is saying, "Oh, when I was sailing on a great ship Argo 3,000 years ago, this happened." You know, nobody questions it. And the old man who is witnessing this storytelling is, I mean, he is so occupied with his own pedantic life and ideas about the relationship between fish consumption and the superiority of the Nordic people that he never questions it either. You know, he's just waiting for his chance to talk about fish. You know, and you know, so the other guy is telling like one of the greatest stories ever told, like, and he's like, okay, so when is he gonna shut up so I can tell people about my theories about fish and the superiority of Icelanders, you know? So yeah, and so it's an example of how we exist in different times and with different occupations, and how that marks our relationship with time. But you know, I just have to tell you to tell two time machine jokes, and
Thank God, I was hoping we'd get to the joke.
one is actually, yeah, it's a joke, but it's also the fact of the matter, you know, and that is the crazy thing, that once the time machine is invented, it will always have existed. That is the strange thing about the time machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not a joke. That's a beautiful paradox.
Yes, yeah.
And jeté is also a paradox.
Yes.
But yes. Joke number two.
And then the joke is actually it comes from a poem by an Icelandic poet called Ragnar Helgi Ólafsson, and he's written this beautiful poem about life after the time machine has been invented. And everybody is doing time traveling, and so every weekend everybody goes time traveling, and it so happens that in certain years, you know, if you happen to go to 1966, there's no one there. So yeah, that's a possibility.
That reminds me of a science fiction short story, I think by Ray Bradbury, who also wrote about he wrote about a world where whenever anybody discovered a time machine, the time cops arrived and instantly seized the plans and vanished the scientist, or persuaded the scientist not to release these plans. And each time the scientist, but people have the right. This is truth. This is science. You can't suppress it. Until the time cop actually explained, well, at first, people would use them to witness grand historical moments, but human beings being human beings, within a heartbeat, they'd start to visit Johnny Depp and Amber Heard's house at certain points, just to witness for themselves. Essentially, all of time travel would turn into YouTube, and the nastier, more malodorous ends of YouTube. And this is why time travel had to be suppressed.
Yeah, and then just the nuisance of people like, you know, going 3 hours back in time to the grocery store because they had run out of sardines, you know, and so you go like, back those 3 hours so you can get your can of sardines,
Or going forward to hear the football results so you can make a bet. Or,
But it's, I mean, one because you mentioned the bullet time in Matrix, it brought to my mind a very interesting observation made by Jean-Claude Carrière, the great French screenwriter and Buddhist. Collaborator of Brooks and co-writer of the Mahabharata, stage play and film. He's written a fantastic book called The Language of Film. And one of the observations he makes there is that when you are staging a duel in a film, the only way to make it understandable and believable is if the bad guy, if the one who is shot, is the first to pull up the gun. And if you think about it, whenever you see a duel, you see the hero, you see the bad guy, you go to the hero, you go to the bad guy, the bad guy pulls the gun, and then you just hear the shot, from the good guy, and you cut to the good guy. So this is chronologically wrong, but our mind can only understand it in this way. And I think this tells us that our minds are capable of dealing with time and narratives in a completely different way than our Western fish brains have been taught how to do it.
That's really persuasive to me. And maybe this is why the novel is such a specialist in it, because it replicates our confusion. It replicates the tricks that our mind has to play to handle this dimension we live in. Why is it in Oslo between, I swear, from 8 o'clock to midnight lasts about an hour and 20 minutes? I get back to my hotel, I've got work to do while I'm here, and I'm hoping to do it in the evening. I sit down at my desk in the hotel at 8, start working, then it's midnight, really quickly. It's like being in your 50s compared to being a teenager, or compared to being an infant. The novel's really good at simulating this. So it's not so much, perhaps, that the novel is the expert on time. The novel is an expert on replicating and simulating the weirdnesses of time as perceived by the human fish mind.
I haven't been keeping track of time at all. So how much of this stuff have we got left?
We've got 11:22, which is a great number. Isn't that pleasing?
5.
1, 2, 2.
5 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to, David. It was a reference in the intro to the sort of expanded universe that's where a lot of your novels are now connected through various characters, and some of those characters you could say are immortal in a sense. In other words, they're people that live, in a way, experience time totally different to humans, who are characterized in one of your books as bone clocks. So that seems to be quite an interest in your work that's grown over time. What is your interest in that sense of immortality? And is it because it's in some way an antidote to the passage of time and decay?
Death. One gets older. If one is lucky, one gets older. And I would like a healthier relationship with my own entropy than... This is here in your work too, Katie. I want a healthier relationship with entropy than blind fear and panic. And the model here is David Bowie, still working right until the end. I've heard this probably started as an urban myth because it's just too perfect, but as urban myths do, it has acquired the solidity of a tried and witnessed anecdote. But he was only had a few weeks to live, but straight into the recording studio, as if he looked death in the face and said, "Oh, I could use you. I can make an album about you." I just love that attitude. I love that spirit. It beats being terrified. So I suppose this is my tiny little fish mind bus driver imitation of the great late David Bowie. By thinking about it, by having an immortal who's going to have a really different relationship with time, by thinking about how, of course, this is a cliche, but it's the end of our lives as long as we're fortunate enough to get a reasonable span of years, but it's the end of our life that gives life value. If we had this endless, bottomless bank account of days, how valuable would the day become? So hopefully think about entropy and, to use its true name, death, in my work, because I aspire to sort of transmute that fear into a place where I can think about death as a companion who walks with me through life and says, just remember, like, don't waste time, and I'm here and I won't be going anywhere, but fix that stupid argument. And if you're about to say this thoughtless thing to your wife, just bottle it in, just keep it in, because it's going to waste time to take it back. So just, I like to think of death as a wise companion who keeps me on the straight and narrow as a human being, and to use my time well. Time well. Here we are, that word again. Over.
Yeah, well, we also said time takes a cigarette.
Oh, puts it in your mouth.
He was so amazing. So, I mean, it's time that takes a cigarette, not the cigarette that takes time. So time is your companion in getting that cigarette out of the question.
You're good. You're so good.
Well, no, come on,
you're good at this.
Time is also waiting in the wings, although I just got a signal that we had actually a little bit of expansion of time.
No, but the relationship between time and death, I mean, that's obviously what it is about. I mean, if we live with constant awareness of time, we are living with constant awareness of death. And you can have different relationships with death. And to quote someone who Bowie quoted, especially in his early career, William S. Burroughs, he said, death needs time for the things he kills to grow in.
Death needs time for the things
he kills to grow in.
Damn, that's good.
So time is the soil for the things that grow, for death to take. So we are the forest growing in the soil of time for death to come and harvest. Isn't that nice?
That's what I This is sort of, if you've ever wondered what novelists do after festivals in the bar in the wee small hours, it's a sort of card game of quotations like this, and he's a really good player. This isn't a superior one, but it's kind of that in a California tech bro way. Steve Jobs referred to his own impending mortality, or he discussed it in 5 words. Death is nature's change agent. Kind of beautiful too.
Yeah.
It's the same. Yours is more impressive, but in a Californian way, this is impressive too. You know.
Yeah.
When I was thinking about this last night, it struck me that, and also very much with thoughts of the Future Library project, with these texts sort of cryogenically sealed up there at the top of this building, that in a way, books, texts, stories, especially myths, are fantastic time travelers themselves. They are some of the things in our culture that have actually traveled the longest and furthest.
Myths are good ones. Myths are really good ones. Come to think of it, isn't a myth a completed and ever-ending future library? A myth is not just 100 years, it's all the way from Homer to now, all the way from even older Indian myths to now. They're always with us and always inhabiting us. We can still talk about Odysseus being a man of twists and turns. Even now, we can talk about the Cyclops. Even now, and we all know what we mean, at least a lot of us who are similarly acculturated. They are sort of the individual trees that are growing through time and never get felled. They are the books that are the trees.
Do you have any thoughts about that, Sjón?
About the time traveling element of books.
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to come to it from another angle. Karl Ove Knausgård mentioned and paid celebration to the dream poem, the Norwegian dream poem from medieval times that he told us about, and that we then heard examples from at the ceremony. And it's about this man, Olaf, who is taken out of time for 13 days, and he returns to tell the story. And it made me think that what we do when we are writing is that we are actually asking people, the readers, to fall out of time while they read our books. And that is a big generosity, I must say, on behalf of the readers, to actually step out of their timeline and step out of their routine and enter our books and be with us in our books, and then go back to their own timeline and maybe tell the story of what happened to them when they were out of time in our books. So that is one way of looking at it. You know, books take you out of time.
Writers are readers too. We were readers before we were writers. Maybe one of the reasons we became writers is that it's such a trip. It's such a beautiful thing to do. When you put it like that, it's not actually the world. It's not actually Narnia we go into through the wardrobe. It's Narnian time we go into. We're out of our bedrooms. We're out of our childhood concerns. We're out of school. We're in Narnia time. And really pleasingly, time and space is the same stuff. Isn't that beautiful?
One thing that came to my mind yesterday when I saw the silent room for the first time, I mean, I had seen some photos from the inside of it. I had never been there. And it is that the shape of it and the color of it, it looks so ancient. It looks like an opening into a cave in the desert. And that led me to think about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the discovery at Qumran, when this goat herd lost one of his goats and discovered it had fallen down this hole, and he went down into the hole, and there were these caves, you know, and in the caves were clay pots, and in the clay pots were the scrolls, and somehow this. The shape of the silent room tells that story too. That, you know, that let's hope that in 100 years, you know, you don't have to fall through a hole to get into the Deichman's library, and then you discover this cave and with our scrolls. But the history is so full of lost books and lost cultures that then are discovered by accident and are being, you know, preserved in earth somewhere. So the future library, I mean, it brings all this to the mind and into play in such a beautiful way. And I know we're running out of time, but one thing I enjoyed yesterday was when the chief forester told us that the root system had now established itself in the forest. And it's, of course, marvelous that it happens on the same day that the project establishes itself here in the library. But it also told me that Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, Sjón, Han Kang, and Elif Shafak, they all joined before the root system had established.
Because you're such rootless cosmopolitans.
Yeah.
How are we doing now? Is that a good 2 minutes?
You think you can talk for 2 minutes more? No?
Yeah. You want to do 2 minutes solo? I just wanted to throw in... No, go on. Only that.
According to conspiracy theorists, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls actually contain? They contain Gnostic, Coptic versions of the biblical tales, which, if you believe the conspiracy theorists, at least, turn on their heads many of the precepts of Christianity as we know it. I think there's one where Jesus as a boy scoops up a handful of earth and molds it into a bird, and it flies away like that. There's another one where a boy bullies Jesus, and so Jesus just smites him down, sucker, and he's dead like that. There's the Gospel of St. Jude in there, of Judas in there, I believe. And if you believe the conspiracy theorists, there's more that we don't know about. So it's not just these manuscripts are quaint old things that were found. Actually, if you read them, they could perhaps influence in their tiny little baby way or their huge, great Titanic way, the future.
So when your manuscript is read in 2114, it will completely change people's understanding of the world as it was at the beginning of the 21st century. It will be like,
oh, the missing link.
It will offer a time bubble in which people can immerse themselves just like anything we read now can do that. And art works, the reason we want to do it, we read a good book to have our minds changed about a small thing or a big thing. My case, pretty small, but the principle's the same. You want your mind changed. You want to leave the bubble of a book a little bit altered. That's what I want from a book.
Jean-Claude Carrier again. He says that the time you spend in the theater or the time that you spend in the cinema or at a dance show or reading a book is a time gained. It's a time gained. You add to your time.
It's so true.
While you're doing it. And he's a specialist on time and narratives and French surrealist Buddhist. I tend to believe him.
Reading, gardening, you never want your time back. Even if it's an okay book rather than a great book, it's still fine. That's the deal. You don't want your time back. YouTube, 98% of TV shows, you want your time back. And that's why the book has a future.
Well, I think that's the closing. That's the sort of like the.
Thank you. This was definitely time gained. A wonderful conversation, joyful, interesting. I think you three should make a group and travel around and talk about time throughout the world. It will be a great success, and I believe you will win some awards from it. We will have a small break, 10 minutes, and then we will come back to hear David. 10 minutes, and I see you back here. Thank you. Hello? Can you? Are you able to hear me? Okay. Some of you are eating, and I promise there will be more time for lunch. The cafe was a bit early out with the food, so you started to eat. That's good. You can fill your stomach. But before we have the original lunch, you will listen to David Farrier. He's the professor of literature and the environment at the University of Edinburgh. Among other things, he has written the book Footprints, In Search of Future Fossils, which won Royal Society of Literature Award. He knows the work of Katie Paterson very well, and he has previously written an article about the Future Library. And he will, for the next 15 minutes, talk about the Locked Museum. Please welcome David Farrier.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I know that some of you are quite eager for your lunch, so just think of me as an appetizer, I guess. I want to thank Katie and Anne Beate for inviting me. It's an enormous privilege to have witnessed the ceremony yesterday and to be here now. And I'd like to thank Marta as well for organising my visit. So this is called the Locked Museum. After the death of the English polymath Thomas Browne in 1682, a bizarre document was discovered among his papers. Museum Clausum, or the Locked Museum, was a catalogue of books, pictures, and rarities scarce or never seen by any man living now. Its impossible entries included a map of the entire Mediterranean seafloor, complete with mountains, valleys, and deserts. A vial of water drawn from stone, and a glass of spirits so volatile its contents can only be shown, Browne says, by the light of a ruby. Museum Clausum is a fictional version of a Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Wonders, a common possession among natural scientists like Browne in the 17th century. Future Library is a modern-day, equally fabulous Cabinet of Wonders, a library locked for 100 years. I was very fortunate to go into the secret room a few days ago, and the experience reminded me very much of visiting a Neolithic tomb called Maes Howe, that's situated on the island of Orkney. This tomb is designed so that you have to crawl through a very narrow passage on your hands and knees. When you come out into the tomb, it is as if you have entered a space outside of time, a space set aside. This sense of wonder that we get from the Cabinet of Wonders, the Wunderkammer, and also this sense of time set aside extends, I think, to the writers, some of whom are with us now, who have added to the library store. What must it feel like to write a contribution to be set aside for so long? It almost seems as if they themselves have been set aside from the rest of us, connected differently to the world to come by the act of writing. But then, perhaps the rest of us aren't so different to the likes of Tsitsi Dangarembga, Carlo Vanausgaard, Sjón, or David Mitchell. It's a fact of 21st century life that we're all telling stories to the deep future. Heat generated by the carbon we've added to the atmosphere will cause the oceans to rise for several centuries. The last of that carbon may not be weathered away for 100,000 years. We built cities of such immensity that their foundations will be present in the fossil record tens of millions of years from now. These traces are stories, too, of a kind. It isn't comfortable to think that the earth will bear such exacting witness to how we lived. I once asked my friend, the Australian novelist James Bradley, what message he would leave for future generations. He paused before answering, "We know you're there," although his tone suggested this was more in hope than in confidence. But the fact remains that they are there, at our shoulder, waiting to inherit the world we gift to them. Standing here in the same building as the secret room, that storehouse of hidden wonders promised to readers who have yet to be born, I want to echo my friend James and say, we know you're there. The story we're telling is for you. We hope when you hear it that it's good. Of course, the story so far is far from good. Not if you are, say, a child of the 22nd century who wonders how a tropical reef might have looked. Or indeed a child born today in Bangladesh facing the loss of essential rice fields to salt water. Or her cousin in India enduring 49-degree heat waves. Or any indigenous person born in the last 3 centuries. We heard just earlier about chronoclasms, moments when different orders of time collide. Time in the Anthropocene is distorted. It splits, it multiplies, and it accelerates. It runs at different speeds. People in other parts of the world are already living in the future that we anticipate. As we stood in the Future Library Grove yesterday, Karl Ove told us that the work he had written was removed from time, outside the continuity of life. The same is not true, however, for the forest itself. All living things keep time, according to the rhythm of the seasons, to changes in daylight and temperature, and so on. The biologist Barbara Helm calls the mechanisms that regulate this wild clocks. Clocks ticking in the cells of every animal and plant, which tell them when to breed, when to migrate, when to leave hibernation, and so on. But human activity is playing havoc with many wild clocks. The seasons no longer mean what they once did. In the UK, spring arrives up to a month earlier than it did 30 years ago. Electric light cues songbirds to sing at night. These unreliable or volatile rhythms can cause significant problems. Greenland caribou, for instance, must time their calving to coincide precisely with the plant growing season. But as rising temperatures cause Arctic plants to bloom earlier, the caribou arrive at their feeding grounds after the peak, risking starvation. New rhythms can even produce new species. Climate change has allowed some blackcaps to migrate from Africa to the UK rather than the Iberian Peninsula, a change of direction that penetrates to the genetic level. A few days ago, I visited the Future Library Grove with Anna Victoria Volsnes, a plant biologist from Oslo University. We sat drinking coffee in the Norwegian fashion in the peaceful clearing, and she explained to me how the forest may change between now and 2114. The trees may welcome new neighbours, she said. Oak can already be found in the forest where none grew even just a few years ago, and beech are extending their range northwards as the climate warms, and may one day grow among the spruce trees. 100 years ago, she continued, cattle grazed these forests. In 100 years' time, wild boar may have crossed over from Sweden. Insects and plants have co-evolved to exist together in complex and delicately timed arrangements, where flowering and breeding very precisely and exactly align. But warming temperatures mean that pine weevils, which prey on the spruce's budding needles in the spring, might extend their breeding season, putting the trees under greater strain. The forest will still be here, she reassured me, but it will not be the same. It will not wait outside the continuity of life. Biologists talk of wild clocks, the internal clocks of plants and animals, as Zeitgeber, or time givers. The forest is itself a time giver. It gives us space in which to contemplate more than human time. But its own time givers, may tell the time differently before the century is out. Among its remarkable treasures, Brown's Museum Clausum contains a book, King Solomon's De Umbris Idearum, or On the Shadow of Ideas. No such book by Solomon is known to have existed, but in 1582, exactly 100 years before Thomas Brown's death, a priest called Giordano Bruno published, under the same title, On the Shadow of Ideas, a treatise on techniques for memorizing the entire structure of divine creation. Like a new version of On the Shadow of Ideas, another of Katie's works, Requiem, tells the story of our planet, from the pulverized fossil remains of the earliest life to the microplastics and concrete that will signal the Anthropocene in 365 handmade bowls of dust. At the opening for Requiem last month in Edinburgh, I was very fortunate, indeed privileged, to pour a layer of one of these bowls into a specially made glass urn. The bowl I was given to pour was the size and shape of a cupped palm. It felt like a ritual. The gesture of cupping my hands around the bowl was both a petition and an offering, as if to acknowledge that in pouring a layer into the urn, I was also adding something of myself. I love the ritual element of Future Library, that sense of ceremony that was so evident yesterday, and that's so much about being together, about gathering now and remembering the future. But I know, I'm sure we all know, that rituals can and do change. One of Franz Kafka's briefest stories tells us so. It goes like this: leopards break into the temple and drink to the dregs what is in the sacrificial pitchers. This is repeated over and over again. Finally, it can be calculated in advance and it becomes a part of the ceremony. Our ritual will not stay the same. One day the trees will grow too tall to allow crowds to watch the handover. As the forest grows, so will the means we use to mark each new deposit in the library. Like the priests in Kafka's story, in years to come, the ritual will adapt itself to the changing shape of the forest. In the future, the trees may dictate what form the ceremony takes. And isn't that wonderful? The silent room won't give up its secrets in our lifetime, but it does pose a question about how we live now. What moved me most yesterday was Tsitsi's observation that Future Library is about the present and about how this moment can lead to a different future than the one that we fear. Future Library is about community. Yes, with those who have yet to be born, but also community with the forest and crucially with one another now. We are Future Library. It's us. And we each have a part to play in the story being written. What tense would you choose to live in? The poet Osip Mandelstam once asked his journal before answering his own question. I want to live in the imperative of the future passive participle, in the what ought to be. For now, the library, like the future it is promised to, is locked. We do not know what either holds. And yet in this time, when time itself runs at strange speeds, what ought to be is the only tense in which we can hope to find life. So I say to the generations who will read these works, and to all of those who will follow them, we know you're there. The story we're telling is for you. We hope when you hear it that it's good. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was Beautiful, really, really beautiful. From your thoughts through to the woods and back again. Wonderful. Welcome back. Welcome back after lunch. Time is relative. We were supposed to start 1 o'clock. We are starting 10 minutes past. But we are going into the second and just as great a part of the program as when we started this morning. And we are about to engage in a conversation between Tsitsi Dangarembga, perfect, thank you, and Panashe Chigumadzi. They will enter the stage in a few minutes in a conversation called The Marvellous Stillness of Being. Tsitsi Dangarembga from Zimbabwe was the 8th author to the Future Library. She's a filmmaker, an activist, and a writer, of course. And she has gained international recognition from her trilogy of novels, Nervous Conditions, The Book of Not, and This Mournable Body. It's written over 3 decades. The first book were written in 1988. She was the first black woman from Zimbabwe to get a novel published in English, and I think that would give her an applaud in itself. And the BBC named it one of the top 100 books, the book Nervous Conditions, that has shaped the world. Katie Paterson has said about her writing that she examines oppressions, discrimination, and systemic racism through writing that is brave and unforgettable. And Panashe Chigumadzi is born in Zimbabwe, and she grew up in South Africa, where she's considered one of the most promising young writers of her generation. Her debut novel, Sweet Medicine, came in 2015. Her second book, These Bones Will Rise Again, a historical memoir reflecting on Robert Mugabe's oyster, was shortlisted for the 2019 Alan Parton Award for Nonfiction. She's a columnist for the New York Times, and she's contributing numerous places. Dangarembga and Chigumadzi will talk about time and nature, as we do throughout the day in different manners. And to moderate the conversation, we are lucky to have Andreas Delsett with us. He is as well a writer, and he has been the head of programming at the House of Literature that has been working for many years with literatures and debates, and they have had a special focus on Africa. So Andreas is well known to African literature and both to Tsitsi and Panashe. So please give them a warm applause.
Wow, this is such a privilege. Thank you for the invitation. I usually start any conversation with a writer thanking the writer for having written the book that we're going to talk about. And I think that rarely, if ever before, has my gratitude been more profound than at this moment with you, Tsitsi. I read Nervous Conditions when I was a young student, and it changed my perspective on the world profoundly. So I thank you for giving us Tambudzai and Malusha and Mainini and my guru, and not to mention Nyasha. And I'm very proud that I am able to be the first one, hopefully, I think, as far as I know, to be the first one to announce that just recently your whole authorship has been sold in rights to Norwegian publication. And so Forlaget Press, who also happens to be my publishing house, they will start publishing Nervous Conditions, as well as your forthcoming memoir, essay collection, Black and Female, from next year. So thank you so much for being here and for your books. And we're joined also today by Panashe, whom I also hold to be one of my favorite writers. And These Bones Will Rise Again, which I read a couple of years ago when it came out, one of the most important books I've read in recent years. So thank you also. And I thought I wanted to start with making the connections between the two of you. So how did it happen that, we know why you were invited into the Future Library, Tsitsi, but how did you end up having also the great company of Panashe here with us today?
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Andreas, for that. How did it happen that Panashe is here? Maybe you can tell us better, Panashe. But, excuse me. What I remember is that I met Anne Beate Hovind in London a couple of months ago, no, about half a year ago in November, something like that, because we wanted to do an interview for this event. And you said you had seen the Pinter Prize Awards 2021, which was in October. And Panashe...
And which you won. Just that, yeah.
And Panashe had been asked to present on that occasion. And everybody was blown over on the occasion. And when you saw the recording of it, you were blown over. And it was just by consensus that we wanted to have Panashe here.
Much agreed.
This is the first time I'm hearing this story, actually. So I just got an email, Future Library, and I was kind of feeling grumpy, and I was like, oh, what is this? And then, so anyway, I'm glad that I got over my frumpiness and do this amazing project.
May I just say something else, though? But I have a personal reason, because Panashe is extremely busy and has so much work to do, is involved in so many things. And when my daughter went over to Harvard, I sent a message and I said, Panashe, please look after her. And you took your time to do that. And it was just so impressive. You're doing so many things, but yet you went out of your way. And I am really grateful.
Thank you. Well, I will say that the other day, so I bumped into Tsitsi in the lift. I haven't seen her in a long time. And I think, actually, it's very funny for me to be calling her Tsitsi, not because of her as a writer, but also as a person. In our culture, we don't fear age. Age is something to, something you accumulate. There's problems with it, but there's also something wonderful about, a culture that appreciates aging and seniority. So as my senior, I cannot just be calling her Tsitsi. I should be saying Mai Tonde, meaning Mai Tondirai, which is the name of her daughter. And of course, when she sent me a message, I couldn't say no, even if I wanted to. My senior told me that. So it had to be my job. Whatever I was doing, I had to find. But it was really wonderful, and I think just what you've done as a mother as well. I think I was saying the other day, I'm sorry to do this digression, but it was really great for those of you who are on Saturday, and you saw Katie as well with her son. I think it's a really important thing to be able to see the messiness of life, or the fullness of life, not just these writers who come from side doors and, write and go back. And usually writers have wives who do all the work for them. But what about the writers who might be the wives themselves or are partners and have full lives? So I think it's been really great to see, you as a mother as well, and not just the all-seeing, all-knowing artist who's removed from society. So that's been really wonderful. So thank you for modeling that.
But the main character in your first novel is called Tsitsi. Yes. Although that's a slightly, or maybe actually it's the kind of the direct opposite persona of the Tsitsi that we have in presence here.
People have asked me about that, and to be quite honest with you, Tsitsi is actually quite a common name in Zimbabwe, and it's also, and there are also things that happen subconsciously, but there's always just been a Tsitsi in my head as a sort of composite of Zimbabwean women. And so she's appeared in other short stories and that kind of thing. So, but it wasn't any kind of, I mean, I have family members being like, that's me in the book, and I was like, no, actually it's just, so it's my long disclaimer.
But Tsitsi, you wrote in the pamphlet that this is one of the most important projects that you've taken part in. And you touched on that yesterday as well. But I wanted to ask you that as a means of starting to talk about time. Again, you write about being in nature and experiencing time standing still. So we talked a lot about today as well. We heard a lot about like backward time, forward time, but time standing still. What is the significance of that experience for you?
Time standing still is subjective. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about a subjective experience. And I'm talking about the kind of experience, excuse me, I think there's something in the air that's not agreeing with me here.
You have some water on there.
Yeah, I do, but I actually can feel it. And I'm very susceptible to dust and things like that. So I apologize. Please bear with me. Thank you. Every time I have a problem, I get medicine here. It's really wonderful. So, yes, so I'm talking about a subjective experience. And the world of the subjective is really interesting for me because it is the world that has the possibility of going beyond the bounds of the body. So when I talk about time standing still, I talk about an experience where my subjectivity, my being, that is not corporeal, is expanded and moves out and, and can engage with what is beyond my own personal boundaries. It's what happens when you dream. When you dream, you don't have a sense of time. So it could be standing still or it could be racing, but you have broken those boundaries imposed by time and flesh.
And then you also introduced these concepts. You mentioned it, you all talked about it yesterday as well, and it's in the pamphlet as well. Different dimensions of time. And you introduced the concept of Zamani and Sasa. Would you explain a little bit more about what that pertains?
Yes, but I'm really sorry. I have to take my medicine first.
we could have asked Panashe to enter on that point as well to help you on the way. I mean, because these concepts, they are not derived from, but they are usually referred to in the form of the writing of Sjón and Beate, and you quote him as well in your piece.
So it's interesting what Mai Tonde referred to yesterday. Mother of Tondirai, that's who I'm referring to here, was specifically around Sjón Beate's concept of time. In his book comes out 1969, African Religions and Philosophy. And he's a ordained, I think, Catholic or Anglican priest, writing about African philosophy and African ontology. And there's a very famous chapter in that book on African ontology. I will add, and this pains me a lot to say because he is my elder and an elder that has departed as well, that it is a controversial chapter that has also been contested by many Africans as well around the conception of time and the idea that we have two dimensions of time, so namely past, long past, and present or immediate future, but not long-term future. And a lot of African theologians or African philosophers have taken deep umbrage with that conception of the idea that Africans don't have a conception of time. And which is good. It's important to know that Africans also debate. So even when we talk about Africans philosophy, the African philosophies, so even in this text that I write here, and speaking about a relationship or different relationship to permanence, writing about Nguni culture, particularly Ndebele culture, and the idea that we do not, or amongst Ndebele people, a settlement is never meant to be permanent. My friend who's Yoruba, Bibi Bakari Yusuf, for example, she reads this and says, well, that's not in my culture, for example. You need to be specific. Don't just say African cosmology, because it's specific to that culture, not all African cultures, just to say that. So there are many different conceptions of time. But specifically what John Beatty speaks about is the idea that there are two conceptions of time, Zamani and Sasa, and that African life is around that. But I really did appreciate the way in which you had interpreted it around the idea of the backwards facing, or perhaps the ways in which time is constantly moving in between and interplaying between us, between different states. And I think that's something that I speak to, and I know that's what I work with in These Bones Will Rise Again, is the idea that we are in constant, or we're in different temporalities all the time, multiple states of time. And part of what happens in the colonial, or because of the interruption of coloniality, as you're speaking of yesterday, is that flow between generations has been interrupted. So there's this cult, and across the world really, this idea, this cult of youth, and the idea that the future will be better with the youth, for example. So in Zimbabwe, there's this idea that, once the old man goes, we'll be fine. I think it's been 5 years, since the coup, not a coup, happened, and we've seen it doesn't work like that. You actually have to do the work. And that young people can be terrible too. You can't just have the idea that as long as time progresses, things will be okay. A lot of these things are very much intergenerational efforts, which is why I define Chimurenga as an intergenerational struggle. It's those in the present working with those in the past about the future to come. And specifically, both of us reference John and Beatty. There's a part that I reference and speaking to what ancestral or spirit possession is. It is about people in the present contemporizing those in the past, right? So you are communicating with your ancestors about the present or the past or the future. But there's that multiplicity of time that's part of rituals and traditions that then has been lost through the Christianization, through the Westernization, and that's what is being interrupted by the introduction of Western time and the kind of industrial time and what that is meant for society.
No, I feel like David Mitchell earlier today when there's like 4 or 5 things I want to want to say or ask to follow up. But if you have, if your voice is somewhat back, I understand in your like interpretation of Beatty as well. There's like an ambivalence, right, to these dimensions of time.
Well, for me, it's not so much as an interpretation. It's a possibility, a potential. We are in a particular culture that sees time in a particular way. Is it possible to see time differently? I do not think that positing that people have 2 dimensions or 10 dimensions or 3 dimensions really means that one way is the correct way. They could all be correct. But what I am interested in is what are the effects of certain ways of relating to the passage of what we call time. And when I look at it, let us take as a proposition that there are mainly 2 dimensions of time in culture A. I would then ask myself whether these dimensions of time in culture A have brought the globe to the point where we are not sure that we can sustain it, and whether they have brought human beings to the point where their offspring are not sure whether they will live into old age. Then I would say, let us look at having 3 dimensions of time. What has that done to the world? So for me, having 3 dimensions of time may not be better than having 2 dimensions of time. But I think that acknowledging that this is a possibility opens up space for interrogation. And what I like about Mbiti is that he is not grounding his thinking in Western discourse. He may be using some of the tools of it, but he is attempting to be empirical in his observation. Whereas to come back and say, Africans, of course, have as many dimensions of time as those other people, is, in my opinion, valorizing those other people. And I think that this is something that we have to be very, very conscious of. Another example of that kind of valorization that comes, I think, from this idea that whenever a comment is made about African culture or something that can be common across African cultures, it is made in a derogatory way. I look at the government in Zimbabwe today, and almost everything they do, even up until today, is as a reaction to the West. If somebody has a particular thought that they don't like, it is because that person is being controlled by the West. If something goes wrong in Zimbabwe, it's because the West has done this and the West has done that. And I say to myself, can one see that in reacting in that defensive way, one is being completely controlled also? And so I think for me, it is useful to open up, to admit that differences in perception exist. And so if they exist, why can these differences not also exist in the perception of time?
I was thinking, we've been looking a lot into the future in the last couple of days, but I was thinking we could do another exercise of like imagining 100 years from now, but maybe in the other direction. May I ask you to read a little bit, Panashe, from your text?
It's the which bit?
Just from the start.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This reminds me of reading at church. So page 5, John chapter 10.
And then you don't lean into the left column. You stay in the right column.
Oh yes, because minus page 15 September.
To those who haven't seen it, it's
trying to read
in
it.
Norwegian on one column and then in English on the other. Eh?
I don't think my Norwegian is bad. So, ukuchisa, setting fire to the future. Ukuchisa, to burn, to set fire, to regenerate, to renounce material being for historical being. We remember the 15th of September, 1881, 7 days after the full moon. As King Lobengula's Nduna Umagwegwe Fuyani sets fire to the king's palace, the queen's dwellings, the royal enclosure, the sheds, its stables, byres, coach houses, and even the wagons of King Lobengula's father, the late King Mzilikazi. When his task is finally finished, Umagwegwe, Gobulawayo's Nduna, shakes the hand of the missionary who accompanied him and says, Ngilambile, that is to say, I am hungry. Umagwegwe has done well on the king's instructions. 3 weeks ago, King Lobengula informed his people that it was his pleasure to transform Gobulawayo, founded by him in 1870 as a great capital of the Amandebele state, the queen of the sacred Matobo Hills, from his residence at Amache, Amhlope, the white rocks near Matobo Hills, to the hills of Mslabatini. Gobulawayo must burn because Amandebele's king's capitals are never permanent. Our ancestors have taught us humility before the cosmos, nature, and time. We must not attempt to conquer the cosmos, nature, and time through permanence. Instead, we must live in rhythm with them for continuity, eternity, and endlessness, hold the center of our cosmology and philosophy. 11 years since first arriving in Amache Amhlope and reaping from its surrounds, it is time that we move on and allow nature to return to this rhythm and replenish itself. Second Testament of the Bible. Ukukhumbula, to miss, to remember, to remember historical being. We remember March 2015 as a crane lifts the bronze stump from its stamp. As a crane lifts the bronze mass from its stump, crowds gather rapt, ready for Rhodes' fall. Stembile Msezane rises into the spirit of Chapungu, the great bird of Zimbabwe, 8 soapstones of which were looted after Rhodes commissioned Great Zimbabwe's excavation. 7 were returned, the 8th still lies in Rhodes' bedroom in Grooteskier Museum. Msezane does not seek our ancestors' permanent domination of the landscape. Rather than erect permanent monuments in the vein of Rhodes' arrogance, Msezane remembers our ancestors' humility before the cosmos, nature, and time. We must not attempt to conquer the cosmos, nature, and time through permanence. We must live in rhythm with them, for continuity, eternity, and endlessness hold our cosmology and philosophy together. Msezane remembers the historical being of our ancestors. She does not turn to bronze, iron, or clay. She turns to spirit. So be the word of the Lord.
So this is in 1881. So that's a few years before what is referred to as the first Chimurenga, the first resistance against.
Amongst the first major problems being that in the nationalist authorized history, they will erase all the other.
That's recorded as the first one, and then the second one is the one from 66, more or less onwards, which is the War of Liberation. Why did you choose to include this idea of setting fire to the future into this future library setting?
Or I might just, when the police statement comes for the arsonist, like, was she the one who burnt the library? No, what had happened is that a few years ago, as I referenced in this piece, the library at the University of Cape Town had burnt. And there were, many conversations. Of course, people were very devastated, and particularly not just the library, but particularly the African Studies collections had burnt at the University of Cape Town. And that was a very painful moment for a lot of us. But there were also people who thought, well, maybe, and of course this is not uncontested space. There had been Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall that had been happening, the student decolonization movement happening a couple years back. And part of it was really thinking, what is our relationship to these spaces? What is the relationship to permanence? And a few years earlier, again, I referenced this in this piece, I had presented a talk at the university, or rather at the National Gallery of Bulawayo, on the portraiture of the last king, or who is known as the last king of the Ndebele, Queen Lozeke Dlodlo. And, I'd gone through the archives and presented all this, research about her. And, someone puts their hand up and said, well, this is great, but why are you using colonial archives to do this? Gave a long answer, but well, actually access, blah, 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 blah. But then, the historian Paterson Anne Beate, who's absolutely amazing and brilliant, and I spoke to him about this piece, then said, well, he raised his hand and said, well, first of all, how many of you have seen Iwisa Sangosi, Iwisa Lengosi, right? Meaning, how many of you seen his Nobgeri, which is sort of a walking stick, if it's really poor translation of that. But how many of you seen it? And people said, well, I haven't. And they said, well, you haven't seen it because it's in the British Museum. But part of that, you also haven't seen, and the reason why it's in the British Museum is that it was taken after the kingdom or the state of Bulawayo had been burnt by the Ndebele themselves. King Lobengula's instructions were to burn it. I thought, whoa, that's interesting. It wasn't the British who burnt it, they burnt it themselves. And this was the British who salvaged that to put into their museum. So I thought, okay, so this was years ago, and I just kept on thinking about that for a long time. Then the fire happened in Cape Town, and I thought, okay, read the room. It's not the time to speak about King Lobengula, setting fire to his state. And so I thought about it for a long time. I thought, well, this is a really interesting proposition about a relationship to materiality, in particular a relationship to material culture, which is what he then referenced. Say, the question of archives, as a historian, you should know, is a question of material culture, and how a culture chooses to do the work of memorializing, how a culture chooses to do history and thinks about what is history. And that was important, one, at a larger structural level in Black studies. There's a huge talk right now about archives, archives, archives. Where are we in the archives? And these bones will rise again. A large part of what drives me is the fact that I lost a photograph of my grandmother. So I'm looking for personal archives. Where is my history in the physicality, in the materiality? But then you have to then think, well, the photograph is a very recent technology. The daguerreotype, those of you who are photo historians or visual historians will know it's only sort of early 19th century, late 19th century that you have the photograph. So my idea that I cannot remember my grandmother because I do not have a photograph of her is very ahistorical, number one. And it's a kind of coloniality of being and thinking that I cannot remember her if I do not have a physical aspect of her. And so that was a kind of challenge to think, what is my relationship to archives? How are we to think differently about archives? And Paterson Anne and I had a really great conversation in preparation for this to think about what exactly is the cosmology, the African or specifically Ndebele or Nguni cosmology that informs that relationship to material culture, which is what is explored in this book. And I think it's an important provocation in thinking about a humility before time, particularly thinking beyond materiality, beyond our physical presence, and needing to have our imprint on the landscape. And that's why I then reference specifically that moment with Roads Must Fall. You should Google it. It's a really, really beautiful performance art piece that Tembile does. As the statue was falling, she is rising, and and it's performance art. And thinking about what does performance art do that's different from erecting an entire statue. She's saying that I'm only going to be here for this moment. Aside from this, if you weren't there, that was it. And having to have that kind of humility to say, okay, that was fine. I'm not going to have any records, maybe the photograph, but the actual performance, the real art was in that moment. And that's it. And that kind of humility about our presence and our time on this earth, I think was really important to really humble myself. I mean, I am terrified by Marie Kondo, for example. My home is, I travel like I'm a bag lady. I travel with a lot of things. I have a lot of books and all of those things. If you had to set fire to my own personal library, I would, I'd be devastated. But to really, really think, who are we without our things? Is the most important question, I think, if we're to think about preserving this world that we've destroyed as, through the art Anthropocene.
Wow. I think it's a brilliant moment just to have you here to talk about these things, also for the significance of the debates that we've had in Norway for the last couple of years about tearing down statues. Which, I mean, to my knowledge, no statues have been taken down in Norway so far, and there's been a lot of debate about it, obviously. And you told me one of the most significant things I've heard said about it is this strange accusation that has come across that the people who want to tear down statues are like negligent of history. Whereas, as you pointed out, in fact, it's entirely opposite, because you are preoccupied with the history and what that history, not only what it was when it happened, but what it also means and how it informs the present, right? I think it's incredibly powerful that we have this text now in the future library as well, not in the room, not to read, but that we can read now.
Well, just to say, I mean, right now I'm completing my PhD in history, and it's interesting because a lot of the work, a large part of what I've been doing has been oral history. At the same time, right now, they're like, well, that's great, but now you need to go to the archive. Like, what you were doing, that's cool, but the real history, the way we know that you're really a historian is if you've gone to the archive. And it's a really interesting thing because the archive is also susceptible to error, right? Many of us in our African families can talk about how our surnames were spelt wrong, for example, wrong dates, wrong because the district commissioner couldn't hear or was impatient with your grandmother. My father has been using a different name and so all kinds of things, right? But we trust the archive to be correct. But somehow oral history is not correct. The same kind of skepticism should be applied to both of them, right? So I've spent 4 years working and speaking to people about their history, but that's cool, but go and do the real work and go to the archive because that's supposed to be the real history. And I think that's really it's important to think, what is our relationship to time, but what is also our relationship to what we understand as technologies of history, technologies of archiving. And that's really, I think, important, especially because the earth is a finite resource. You know, there's only so much of the earth that we have, and we can't keep building and building or creating and creating, or at least we cannot always be doing that through the material source, and we have to think beyond things and think, you know, beyond our permanence, our physical permanence.
So one of the very important characters in Zimbabwean history, and also playing a role just a few years after the scene that you read, is Mbuya Nehanda. And she also turns up in the present very much. Even in this mournable body, there is a short reference to her when the, what's her name? The Queen of Africa, is that the name of the character who's runs the textile shop just below where Tambudzai is working?
I have no idea.
Okay, so there's
The reason, can I interpret for tell you why my tone doesn't have any idea, because when we were talking about it the other day, that part of the work that we do is a form of spirit possession, right? So sometimes you can produce and you put it out there and you won't even remember what you did because you were possessed when you were writing.
But it's also, once it's gone, it's
That's it.
gone, you know, and I'm on to the next thing. And there's a concept of consciousness being like a pool, a deep pool in my culture. So if I've emptied the pool, then that water has gone, and the next lot comes in. I'm really not concerned with it. And I was told that I had come to put a piece of writing into a cupboard. That's what I was told.
And it's true about the consciousness in the pool, because when I was interviewing Paterson Anne for this piece, you know, this is Zoom, and my terrible Boston Zoom, you know, is you know, cutting off all the time. And I interrupted him and I said, "Can you repeat that?" He said, "Listen, I can't repeat that. Whatever I was saying, that's the spirit speaking to me. So I don't know what I just said. That's it. If you caught it, you caught it. If you didn't, you didn't." And I was like, "Hey, okay, well, that's it." So
that's it. But still, Mbuya Nehanda, she plays an important role in, even today, even politically. I mean, you write it about it as well, Panashe, in These Bones Will Rise Again. I was just trying to use it as a bridge to come into the present somehow, and maybe we can find another way of getting there. But
sorry, where did you want to go?
I wanted to go to the present, and to the fact that
to the present,
that the history that we're talking about, even what happened 100 years before us, since we are here in the presence of this library that is connecting us to the 100 years into the future, I think it's very thought-provoking to remember what happened 100 years ago and how much has changed, but also how this what happened then informs the present today. You were talking about it when we were in the woods yesterday, that this is the part of the project that really is most important, because it connects us to, reminds us of what we do in the present, right? So can
I add this? Let me can I help?
Me. Thank you.
Well, we can just say that contemporarily what has happened, because I mean, These Bones Will Rise Again is part of that, but the idea, Mbuya Nehanda, who is an anti-colonial heroine, which is a really inadequate way of describing the fact that this is a spirit who embodies a medium who was part of this first Chimurenga, and her medium of the spirit was beheaded, or rather she was hung by the British in 1898. And this becomes the figure that people call on. It's part of the revolution, or rather the part of the Chimurenga in the 60s, well, the 70s and 80s. And people will sing Mbuya Nehanda, Kufawa Chitaura, Mbuya Nehanda, who died while singing. And she specifically said, "My bones will rise again." That's the title of my book, These Bones Will Rise Again. So the idea of the fact that we are working with our ancestors to fight for revolution. And when this coup, not a coup, happens, some of these people in the government say, well, we're fighting, this is part of Nehanda's war. So every time there's a new campaign, this is part of the Chimurenga, this is part of what we're doing for the revolution. And now recently in the present, and part of the book is doing an exploration of that, but in the present, what is really interesting, and again, this issue of using the West as the paradigm for how we do things, is that Mbuya Nehanda, there's a statue of hers, which is terrible. I mean, first of all, it was actually terrible, aesthetically terrible, and there were all kinds of really crazy memes that people were using all day, you know, on Twitter, if you saw that, about Mbuya Nehanda, because it was bad, such that they even had to commission another statue because it was done badly. You can Google it. But it was such a comedy of errors that really just spoke to the fact that this is not a genuine enterprise. This was not something that was actually spiritually grounded. This was something that was politically expedient. People who are spending hundreds of thousands on statues while you cannot, you know, pay doctors. You're spending hundreds of thousands on statues while, you know, teachers can barely afford to go to, you know, to work. As you're saying, civil servants cannot even afford to go to work, i.e. you cannot afford the public transport to go to work. So to say that, you know, all these issues in the country, but you are prioritizing a statue of Mbuya Nehanda. I'm the first proponent of history, but it's to say, what is informing the work that you're doing? In that, putting the statue, as you would know, Tsitsi, you're living in Zimbabwe, the point being that that even goes against what it is to honor or kumbula the ancestors. It's not about a statue, it's actually the work of doing and honoring what they had called upon us to do. You can't short circuit that by saying, I'll put a statue and therefore we're honoring her legacy. Honoring her legacy means honoring her descendants now. That's the work that they need to be doing, not putting up the statues.
Yes, I think I agree with all that. And I'm beginning to think about another dimension to the whole Mbuya Nehanda issue. A South African friend said to me, he's a filmmaker, made a wonderful film, and he said to me, Tsitsi, I really want to make a film about Mbuya Nehanda, because there is such an absurdity there, because Mbuya Nehanda was an embodied being. But what moved her, that gave her her power, is that she was said to be the spirit medium of an earlier ancestor who is said to have formed the Munumtapa kingdom, to have begun that with her brother. And so when we are talking about Mbuya Nehanda, we're not actually talking about the flesh that is that the statue is said to represent, but we are talking about a spirit. And so I have begun to ask myself, so what is this spirit? And it is the spirit of empire. Because the Munumtapa Empire was a vast empire that stretched all the way to the coast in the east, what is now Mozambique, and to the Kalahari Desert in the west. So actually, Mbuya Nehanda is, in my opinion, in my reading, a spirit of empire. And so I think we should not then be surprised when we see that spirit of empire being used or abused and materialized in a statue. Because this statue is a symbol of empire. The question then becomes, what empire is being created here by the creators of this statue? And I think that is where Zimbabweans at the moment are in a state of absolute despair and dismay, because actually the empire that is being created now is over the Zimbabwean people by other Zimbabweans. So that's my reading of the situation.
Well, I think importantly, just because I think this is quite an important aspect around really interrogating what is the spirit, who do these spirits mean, and thinking about temporality and that we're living in multiple states of time all the time, and different histories are brought into bear, and what makes this is a centuries-long spirit, as you're referencing. But if we perhaps are then collapsing, saying empire, of course, that also then brings in British Empire, for example. Is there the danger of making, let's say, historical equivalences around that, which is, it's not an argument for sort of a romantic or idealized African past or anything like that, but it is also to interrogate. There's a reason why, for example, for example, that the ANC, even in 1912, so the African National Congress, specifically went to the African monarchs and sovereigns because they were anti-colonial, for example. Part of why monarchy in Africa is not necessarily, well, let me just bring in some of my Marxist history. Part of why, even when the African National Congress was supposed to, and particularly those working with the South African Communist Party, or the CPAC at that time, part of the issue that they had was like, monarchy necessarily is a bad thing. It is necessarily counter-revolutionary. And they said, well, this is not going to work when you go back to the people because of what monarchy or what sovereignty in that context is meant to mean. As we say that they're not functioning, it's a different idiom that it works with. So what I was to say that if you are meant to be mambo, if you're meant to be the king of a particular state, for example, you are supposed to be the embodiment of the people, ideally. That's what it's supposed to be. That empire in that context, in that African context, or let's say in the Mutapa Empire context, might not be empire of, Queen Victoria and the Jubilee, a couple of weeks ago. It's a different kind of idiom, and the idea that the spirituality is very much centered, and that's part of it. So just to say that I think it might be problematic to just call it empire without maybe putting the asterisks and being specific about what does that historically, and what has that meant, and what is it, because as well, we also know that over time with the introduction of the colonialists, for example, they became the puppets of the settler regime. So when people then were against the kings and queens at that time, it meant something different than someone 100 years before the British came. So just thinking about which empires are we talking about, because it is not an unadulterated bad or an unadulterated good necessarily, but I think it's important that, as you're saying, we're thinking, what is the spirit that is being embodied, or that ZANU-PF is embodying when they decide to speak about Mbuya Nehanda or decide to memorialize or concretize her?
Yes, I'm coming to the conclusion that human behavior is not determined by pigment concentrations. I do not know what determines human behavior. I do not know why the kind of human development that took place over the millennia in Africa was in one direction, and it was in another direction elsewhere in the world. This is something I'm reading about now. However, I am not dismayed by that fact. I am not made defensive. I believe that there were human beings who were behaving in the way that human beings behave in all these different manifestations of human behavior. And I feel that there is, it's difficult to say a cosmic reason, that's really grandiose, but I think that there is something of value to us today in those uncouplings. And I think that in order to benefit from that value that exists in those parallelities, we need to know how to engage with them. And I think that the mode that has been adopted as a result of the Western empires having conquered up to about 95% of the world in the late 19th century is maybe not the best model for that. And this goes back to what I was saying before. It is precisely that mode of development that took place in those Western empires that has brought us to where we are now, where we now have a crisis of being. And we are asking ourselves, have we engaged with time in the right way? And for me, that's a really important question. And I think it's a question that spawns many other questions about the ways we have engaged with the world. And I think this is something I've been talking about quite a lot. And so I do not personally believe that one kind of empire is necessarily better or worse. It is domination. The question for me then becomes, is domination a norm in human behavior? Some people will say yes and other people will say no. So then for me it becomes a choice. We choose what kind of society we want to live in. Zimbabweans will tell you, well, we don't have choices, because if we say we want a democratic society and go out on the street, we will be shot. But all through history, we have people who have made the choice to enter into spaces that may actually be dangerous for them physically. So I really think that these differences in the ways of being human that we see are sources of information for us. And I think that by being defensive about them and tending towards one interpretation of what is good humanity, I think we lose a lot. And the longer we allow ourselves to lose that, the more difficult it will be to recoup when the time comes and we realize that these losses have taken place.
It's a really important point that you're making. I like that you mentioned about this question of how did we get here, and thinking about the long durée of human history. A lot of the work that I do is around this question of what is, what's really interesting about the pandemic was like, we're in crisis. It's like, well, actually, a lot of humanity has been in crisis for at least the last 500 years. It's actually nothing new. And this is perhaps one new manifestation or new gradation of it, but the crisis specifically beginning with the idea of the new world, the crisis that begins with that kind of the voyages of discovery, right? So-called discovery, right? There's a specific kind of rupture that happens in the world. I don't believe in sort of progressions, but thinking about ruptures in history to say, what is specifically different about the time or the paradigm that we're living in, particularly the crisis of modernity, Euro-American modernity is what we're living in, and particularly what we're doing right now with the pandemic is just one of the latest episodes in this long crisis, the long durée of this crisis that's inaugurated with, the voyages of so-called discovery, and specifically thinking about going to 1492. For those of you who do some of those studies, particularly Black studies, post-colonial studies, 1492 becomes a very important moment. This is the so-called discovery. Again, every time I say discovery, just imagine me doing this. Discovery of Hispaniola, so that's Haiti and what is now Dominican Republic, and that beginning of the idea that people are property. We've always had enslaved people across the world. That's nothing new, that is true. But the specificity about that moment, and particularly the rise, I don't know how many of you follow what happens in the US, particularly thinking about 1619 Project and thinking about what is the origins of this crisis, and thinking about the idea that what was new is that people are now capital. If any of you have done research, there's a fantastic poem by the poet in Nwesi Phillips called Zong, about the Zong tragedy, the Zong massacre, where enslaved people were thrown overboard. And that was an instance of they were being thrown overboard because they could then claim insurance on them because they were property. Right? And the idea, that was a new paradigm, that we've always enslaved people, but also what is different is that, again, the question of being, and I always ask myself that, okay, fine, it is true that they say we as Africans have, colonized each other. Yes, we might have had some forms of instances of enslavement, but what is specific about that moment with transatlantic slavery and how that changes the whole world. It's not just Africans, it's the whole world. And specifically, if you go to, for example, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he speaks about how the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the discovery of the Americas are two of the single most important events in human history, because it opens up trade, but not just in spices, but also opens up trade in people, for example. And that new paradigm is what the crisis of that is what we're dealing with right now. But specifically, what we're seeing that is different is, to use very philosophical terms, ontological negation, i.e. the negation of being. And what I mean by that is, for example, we're talking about states and empires. And specifically here, I'm speaking about the Ndebele state, right? Because very often, to give you a concrete example, in South Africa, people will say, think about white South Africans, say, well, why are you so upset? Because Shaka Zulu also colonized you and he did all these crazy things. He was like a Napoleon, so why we're just as bad as him, right? That's often the sort of common sense argument for, these are all colonialisms. Why is ours any different? However, what you should understand, if we study the history of even the formation of the Zulu state or the Ndebele state, is that these were very small kingdoms, or let's just say these were very small groupings of people who left, for example. It can't have been more than, let's say, 300 people in the Khumalo clan who moved up until Zimbabwe. They incorporated ranges of people, Sutu, Kalanga, people who were now known as Shona, are Ndebele. There's very few people who are pure Ndebele, if we even want to use a silly term. But the idea being that even within that, there were hierarchies of people, there was inequality, yes, of being, but even with the conquest, they understood that you could still be incorporated into a society. What is different when the British come in and conquer is that they're also negating your being. What I mean by that is that they're negating your spirituality, they're negating your ways of understanding the world, they're negating time. For example, look up scholarship by people like Keleto Actons about the rupture of time. People spoke about this idea, closer people have written about it, say, Ilizwe lifile, the world is dead, our world is dead, because a whole way of being has been interrupted. There's a reason why, again, the Zulu nation was a very small group of people as Shaka Zulu was conquering around, but yet there are no people who are prouder of that history than people today. Right? Because of the fact that you were incorporated, your being was brought into that. What is different with empire is that negation of people's being. And that's part of the fact that people are now property, as well as the world becomes property. Dominion is really important. So it's just to say that when we're doing this kind of thinking about what is different about this specific moment, we can actually go back to a particular moment and think about what is the paradigm that was created then, and then think about it's not just a progression with that. How do we actually rupture that kind of paradigm in which people, the planet is our property, or the property of individual people? That is what we need to break into. So it's just, this is just to sort of maybe add some nuance into the fact that perhaps we can be specific about what has happened to us. I don't have all the answers, otherwise none of us would have to study some of these things. We're wasting my time otherwise, right? But I think we haven't yet gotten to what was so traumatic about enslavement and colonization, particularly transatlantic slavery, because it's not just on the deal of Africa. We know the Dutch East India Company was central to this area, for example. We know the British East India Company, all of those spaces, but that is from transatlantic slavery. And we haven't yet gotten out of the time of slavery, which is why people in Black studies, for example, are always talking about the afterlife of slavery. We can talk about Lloyd's Bank. We can talk about France, for example, and the fact that Haiti is still paying reparations to its slave masters. We're still living in the time of slavery. That's the time that we actually need to be speaking about. And we can point to specific places. And there's a reason why the conversation about the reparations is something that people are always dodging, because we don't want to name the issue that we have at hand.
Now,
yeah, but
just
I would.
Before you respond, Tsitsi, unfortunately we are running out of time, and we are also running out of jokes that can about time that can help us to extend our time. So we need to start wrapping up.
Okay. What was your last sentence? Okay, it's gone. Okay, and you're exactly. You interrupted the spirit, unfortunately, so you'll never know what the spirit was going to say. Yes, but what I want to think about is some of the prompts for those voyages of discovery. And those voyages of discovery were prompted by often growing discontent because of inequality in the Western nations, and the need to find more resources. So even though people might have spoken about exploration and knowledge, it was always about exploitation. But then for me, the question becomes, why was there such inequality in these places that it necessitated bringing into submission almost all of the rest of the world? So I still go back and I think about human behavior and its commonalities, because what we are talking about now is a symptom and a behavior caused by a particular condition. To tell many people who are still in the grips of the post-colonial malaise that we have now, that people in those colonizing countries, maybe about 700 years ago, suffered in exactly the same way, or even worse. I mean, since there were no wheels in my part of the world, people were not put on wheels and dragged on wheels, for example. So I am really getting, excuse me, to the point. You know, people say, Tsitsi, are you feminist? Sometimes I'll say yes, sometimes I'll say no. But the reality is that I am becoming post everything. You know, I hope this isn't actually dangerous for me, but I really find...
The day Tsitsi got cancelled.
I just feel that, again, this whole idea of knowledge being something that you package and being something that you can actually know is in itself false. And this is why when we work in that paradigm, everything that we do ends up being false. And we can see it in the way that we are living now, because everybody is worried about global warming, climate change, sustainability of the planet. I mean, we are the ones who have made sure that our children are born into anxiety. And it's a particular paradigm that has brought us to that. And it is the dominant paradigm, which, as Panashe said, emanated from that point of rupture with those acts where people were made private property. But not only that, that private property was commercialized in a kind of a pre-industrial way, you know, by the way that people were shipped. We think of the Holocaust as the first time when genocide was industrialized. We can think of slavery as the first time when human beings as private property were industrialized also.
No, I'm afraid the thing is, let me assure you that none of you are cancelled. You will not be cancelled at all. On the contrary, Tsitsi, your books will be translated now for years in Norway. So you'll have to come back again and again. And I know for a fact, Panashe, that you're coming back at the first instance in December, and then many times from that on.
Can I make a final remark, please?
Yes, you will. Okay. Finish up on that note. Okay. You will be coming back again and again as well, because you're also part of the big project at the House of Literature for the years to come to strengthen the translation and promotion of literatures from Africa in Norway. So we will see more of the both of you in the time to come. The very final last comment goes to you, Panashe, in the spirit of the event.
Okay, in the spirit of the times. It's great that you say spirit, because, you know, you're thinking of Hegel and the spirit of times and all of those things. But no, very seriously, going back to that crisis of modernity, you know, people like Cornel West would talk about the ignoble paradox of modernity, which is the dark side of enlightenment, right? The idea that I think, therefore I am is not a neutral statement. It is I think against the irrational other who is embodied. The idea that, you know, to be the rational thinking subject who is removed, which is why I made that very specific comment at the beginning, the idea of people being disembodied and removed from the excesses or the enfleshment is very much central and part of the crisis of modernity, right? And the infinite categorization of people, of beings, whether it's Linnaeus, whether it is, you know, the sort of the Cartesian paradigm is part of the crisis that we're in, right? So everything is infinitely spirit, matter, flesh, body, spirit, all of those different things are part of why this crisis happens, and sort of, you know, having to do the cartography of the world becomes really, really important. And I mention this, if we are to think beyond, a new world also requires a new epistemology. We cannot simply continue within the same kinds of paradigms if we think we're going to produce something different. And going back, and a large part of what is interesting to me is going back to specifically, I mean, I come from South Africa. I always go to the Netherlands and they think they're so progressive. And we're like, you are the source of our problems. We think about 1652 is the moment that Jan van Riebeeck comes with the Dutch East India Company to Cape Town, right? And that becomes, you know, the beginnings of colonization or settler colonial, slaver-settler modernity in South Africa. But that's really important because I always think, as Tsitsi is saying, this was in the moment of the protests and reformations, all this violence that is happening in Europe. And I'm wondering, you left there, you were running away from all of that violence in Europe, only to mete out even more violence on the lands that you came upon. What exactly is the crisis? A spiritual crisis that Europe has yet to address.
Thank you so much. Tsitsi Dangarembga, Panashe Chigumadzi. Thank you so much.
I just want to make sure that the text Panashe read from is from this pamphlet. You can find it on the Future Library website, and it's made one for each year as the authors contributes. Let me just put it in here. Yep. Here. But again, thank you so much for your reflections. And thank you for sharing, even with the voice. That's hard. And it's not medicine, it's like candy that can makes you sure. An extra applaud for that. Okay. And we are going to change the scene because we are going into the next topic called Retyping a Library, which is still about the library, but from a different angles. It's about libraries, archives, collections, and paper. And Kenneth Goldsmith, who was here both yesterday and has been here today, his writing has been called some of the most exhaustive and beautiful work yet produced in poetry. And Retyping a Library is a monumental new intervention by Kenneth Goldsmith. And he is here because he has a big exhibition at Kunstnernes Hus, and you can find it there. And in the center of his exhibition, you find more than 200 boxes arranged to form a cube that resembles a sculpture. And inside each box, there's a manuscript on paper. And why there's manuscripts on paper in the box, Kenneth will tell us more about. It's a gigantic work you have started, and I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts and reflection upon it. To talk to Kenneth, we have Hilde Neset here. She's the director of Kunstnernes Hus, and she has been a part of planning this seminar today. So please welcome both of them to the stage.
Oh, okay. Or I can just do it from here. I can just do it from here. Okay, okay. We're gonna. Where do you have the full view? You can just put it next to here. I have full view on here. But I'm gonna do Safari. Where is Safari? Is this open? Is that on? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sure. And Hilde, I'll just go through this really quickly here. Hi, I'm Kenneth. And I'm just going to quickly introduce a few projects that are really related to what's here and absolutely different than the future library that I've been doing. So the piece that is at Kunstnernes House is this. It's called Retyping a Library. And for the past 20 years, I've literally been retyping a library. Inside each of these boxes is a manuscript and a portrait of the different artists. I'm up to about 200. It's taken me 20 years to get to 200 or so. So I can quickly show you what is inside of these boxes. This is the box of Nella Larsen, the great Harlem Renaissance novelist. This is a portrait that I drew of her. And then this is the set that's inside the box. Each one is a signature, a typed manuscript, and the portrait. The portrait then, after I'm finished drawing it, the portrait then gets cut up and put into the box. Then there's a number of signatures, but that's basically like what one of the manuscripts looks like on onion skin paper, and various certificates of authenticity, and that is what the box looks like. Some other projects that I've done. I'm sorry. This I just want to quickly show this. So this is what the show looks like at the Kunstnernes House. On the wall are all of the signatures of the authors. There are the manuscript boxes, and around the gallery are a few, maybe 10 of the boxes that are open. Just some other views of it. Each one is numbered. And it looks sort of like, when a box is opened, it looks like a library ephemera. I've also done other projects. In 2013, I orchestrated the first crowdsourcing printing of the entire internet. And this was in Mexico City then, and that was me laying on top of the internet in Mexico City. Here's like the boxes that just kept coming in. I put a call out onto social media. I figured if every person printed out like 5 pieces of the internet, we could get the entire thing. And I think we pretty much got the entire thing. So this is the organization of printing out the internet. And finally, the last project I want to share with you is at the Venice Biennale, the last one in 2019, I printed out all of Hillary Clinton's emails, the ones that went missing, quote, went missing. And we made a tableau of the Oval Office, and there's the actual printout of the Hillary Clinton emails, and who should show up at the end of the exhibition to read her own emails, but Hillary Clinton herself. And she's so funny. I mean, she actually said, found my emails at the Venice Biennale. You know, come on, Donald Trump. And you know, and she really loved it. She sat there for 2 hours reading her own emails, okay? So this is sort of just a few of the type of projects that I've been doing, and we can,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is this working? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you so much. That was a whiz through of some of your project, and of course, you didn't actually mention the actual archive at the, what can I say, at the base of all those projects, which is UbuWeb.
Yeah. And
perhaps we should start that and your new book, or your newest book, called Duchamp is My Lawyer. And in addition to as a visual artist, of course, you're a poet and you've written many, many essay books as well. But perhaps we can just talk a little bit about the Internet Archive that you set up.
I mean, I'll just quickly throw it on, you know, really,
throw it on.
I mean, really, really fast, because wow. Okay. So in 1996, I began a project that is called UbuWeb. It's the largest archive of free avant-garde materials on the internet. At this point, let's just say if we go to film and video, these are some of the filmmakers that are featured on this archive. If I go into any given one, let's say the great New York filmmaker Rudy Burkhart, each one of these is a film that can be viewed, well, there you have it. There's also, very quickly, there's also an equally large archive of sound, of avant-garde sound. Here is a 52 CD set of the history of electronic and electroacoustic music that somebody gave, or that I found on file sharing, and repurposed there. So each one of those is MP3, and it's 52 CDs worth. So it's an insanely huge, and so what I deal with metrics of information.
Yes.
And oftentimes, you know, how they manifest themselves in physical spaces, how they get archived, how they get distributed, how they get pirated, how they get shared, and most importantly, how they're accessed. In the case of UbuWeb, on this site, there's no advertising, there's no sniffers, there's no trackers, there's no surveillance capitalism, there's no advertising, there's no donation. You just get art. I mean, and it hasn't changed at all since 1996. The internet has gotten horrible since 1996. I hate it. But this site really embodies the spirit of the original internet. And I just do want to say that it is possible still to make your own website without all sorts of crap and junk and corporate code in it. This code still works that was basically written in 1996. It still works today. And they want you to think that you can't do anything anymore, that it's all Instagram, that it's all Facebook, that you have to live in the world of Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or something like that. And you don't. You can still be independent. But they've let us, they've happily convinced us otherwise.
And UbuWeb is an internet archive. Obviously, it exists online. It doesn't exist as a physical embodied archive. But with retyping a library, you decided to well, I suppose, embody the text and make them on paper, which you are typing on a typewriter, am I right? On very thin archive onion-skin paper.
Yeah.
And,
I don't know if it's archival, but it's...
The big question, I guess, is why?
Well, I'm fascinated by transformation of media. You know, what happens when you take media... for example, I loved printing the internet because nobody prints the internet. You shouldn't do that, you know. And what happens? Because in 3 keystrokes, we can have everything that William Shakespeare ever wrote, and then 1 keystroke, you drop it into a Microsoft Word document, right? And it's enormous. And you can take, the scroll bar and scroll through everything William Shakespeare wrote in 2 seconds. And we don't think anything about it, right? And when you see the Shakespeare in the library here, of course, it's enormous. So what does that mean when that's materialized, right? And also, what implications do those gestures have for writing? Because when the entire works of Shakespeare are held in the memory of your computer as a clipboard, you say, okay, now what can I do with this, right? And I believe that's a new writing gesture. Is like the gesture of this sort of possibility of what writing can be. And I think in the digital age of copy and paste is something that's so normalized that we never think about it. But the fact is, it radically changes everything that we do with text, from the way that we write to the way that we can distribute, to really questioning the nature of what writing is. So in 1993, I was sitting at my kitchen table, and at that time, the internet was all text, right? It used to be in a little Unix window. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get really nervous and I highlight text, and you can kind of grab the text and like drag it around the screen. You can still do that, right? And I was doing that on this Unix window, and suddenly, and I was working on a book, and suddenly all that language dropped into my Microsoft Word document. I was like, wait, what just happened? Like this, all that internet can go into my Microsoft Word document, and it falls in, and it looks just like my font. And I thought, wait, did I just write that? What was that gesture? Okay, and then for me, and that's 1993, I figured writing is just never going to be the same. I went from being a producer to being a reproducer. I thought that replicative nature and gesture was absolutely something that was just going to change the nature of writing. But I think I'm the only one that felt that way. I don't think anybody else thinks this is a good idea. Because, writing still sort of, much writing goes on. It was a guy called Matthew Fuller who wrote a beautiful thing early in the days. It's called Microsoft Word. It looks like you're typing a letter. Most people use Microsoft Word like we use the typewriter, right? But it's not. You're typing on an enormously powerful machine with infinitely replicable capabilities. And you're not just writing a letter, you're entering into an ecosystem of replication and mediation in a way that you used to have to put a carbon copy in order to get replication, or run it through a Xerox machine, and then you just get more paper, right? So anyway, these modalities of materiality are something I'm fascinated by, and that's why I began doing this retyping project 20 years ago as another modality, as another, what Marjorie Perloff often refers to as differential poetics, that versioning. Well, she's just talking about DJing, right? The way that like DJs, I often think like, how come writers don't act more like DJs, right? All our writing has to be so original. How about like taking things that existed before and remixing them in new and brilliant ways? It happens, but basically it doesn't happen. So these are the kind of things. And so you can go in and out of paper, in and out of printing the internet, in and out of living on the internet, go back to the typewriter, go back to the hand-on drawing. To me, it's got to be this fluidity. It can't be all one way or the other, because it isn't.
I guess one reason why, the DJ analogy is complicated in literature is there's all sorts of laws around this, which is, I guess, why you've also elected the artist Duchamp as your lawyer. So maybe you can say something about illegality, and also, interestingly enough, we've talked about the origins of Future Library and how all the contracts were really only done this year, actually, and often in order to start such a a huge project like this, you might need to sort of start in the back door, as you've often talked about as well, collecting via the back door as well, which is taken from who you're writing about in the book here, a MoMA director who started sort of opening a back.
This is an amazing thing, you librarians. Listen to this. I hope the whole library is listening. So there was this librarian at MoMA in the 1970s called Clive Philippot, and Clive just decided that anybody could send anything to Clive Philippot, care of the Museum of Modern Art Library, and it would be accepted into the library regardless of what it was. He estimates that during his tenure there, he got 250,000 artists into the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and they're all in there. They're all in the database. So it was such a radical gesture. Nobody even paid any attention because, they were only paying attention to, Gerhard Richter, what's coming in the front door. He has this little back door. He says, come on, everybody in. And it's a lot of crap, and it's still sort of...
Not only.
Oh my God, it's not, there's not, but once in a while, it becomes in handy. So in 1990, the artist Chuck Close wanted to curate a show at MoMA with the artist called Ray Johnson, who really did stuff with mail art. He was rather obscure, and he wasn't in the MoMA collection. And so Chuck Close said to Ray, send a photocopy to Clive at the library, and that way we can pull it into the collection and it can be displayed in the gallery. And so when it went into the front door through the back door, right? And to me, this is absolutely beautiful, the fluidity and the lawlessness and the recklessness. In the end, it didn't hurt MoMA one bit.
And it also says something about institutions and risk assessments and all sorts of things, and how to get projects off the ground when it's a good project. But in terms of just keeping a little bit in with I'm assuming you haven't spoken to, or have you spoken to any of the authors who you have retyped?
I'll show you. You're going to love this. I pulled this up for you, and it's on display for you. Look who I did. I wish he was here, or actually I don't, because it's too stalky. But I actually retyped. I mean, this guy writes long books, right? This one really took me. Wait, let me get to the manuscript. Yeah, this is the second one of my struggle, the one I really love the most. So this thing took a long time to do, and it's on display in the gallery, and it's a really, really giant book. But I thought, right? It makes sense. But so here he is in this box, my box at the Kunstnernes house, and here he is at your box in this library, like writers in boxes. It's like little coffins. This is all about death, Is something about death here.
Or eternal life.
Eternal, which is death, like growing, what Sjón said about like growing death, up. Like these boxes, like they get closed, they're closed, and I don't think they're ever going to be opened. Like it's the same thing, except those will be opened in 100 years, mine will never be opened in 1,000 years. Like why would they be opened, So they became like sort of like these things, like when I cut up the drawing and actually put it inside the box, it becomes like, like the Egyptian mummies, where they put the face on and they become little sarcophagi in a funny way, and then they get buried. And, this will be done when I'm at 1,000. I'm only at 200. It's taken me 20 years. So I'll be working on this the rest of my life.
And you talked a little bit about the origin of retyping my library, which stems from you typing up the entire one day, typing up the entire New York Times.
Yes.
And which is, I guess, is also something you talk about in your book on creative writing.
It's all connected, right? So MoMA Library, Clive Philippot, UbuWeb, uncreative writing, retyping a library, like my whole life is just one version of something else. I haven't done anything creative in 40 years, and I love it. I'm so happy. So the book that Hilde's talking about, like one day in 2000, I received, the newspaper used to come to the doorstep, and the New York Times came, and I had nothing to do. And I just looked at it and I said, I'm just going to retype this entire newspaper from the very, very first thing to the very, very last page. And anywhere there was language on that newspaper, I would grab. So they would have an ad for car license plate, and I would take a magnifying glass and I would put in the language from the license plate on there. In those days, they used to put the stock tables in the New York Times, and they'd have a whole section in like 1-point font. And that took me like 3 months to do that. And in the book, it takes up a full third of the book. And it ended up taking me 1.5 years to do. It was 900 pages long, and it is the greatest book in the world. It's the best novel ever written. It's got love, it's got hate, it's got murder, it's got tragedy, it's got defeat, it's got triumph. I mean, it's got everything in the day's newspaper that's there. And it's written, of course, 900 times every day around the world and then discarded. And next day, another book is written. This is so beautiful to me. So funny thing happened. Everybody, when the book came out, everybody, my friends or whatever, people, the word got out on it. Because I'm a conceptual writer, my books are really, really hard to read. Like, but they're really cool to think about. Everybody thought 2 years or 3 years later, oh, I loved when you retyped the newspaper of September 11th, right, 9/11. And I had actually, my book was September 1st, 2000. So when 9/11 happened and everybody thought later it was 9/11, I went back and I got the newspaper from 9/11. Not the 9/12 where the planes are going into the building, but the one that actually everybody was carrying that day. And I retyped that and I called it The Day. And, you know, the first newspaper piece was nothing. It was like a non-thing. Nothing happened that day, really. But the 9/11 was so emotional. It was unbelievable. The whole day is written out on the front page. There's stories of hijacking planes on the front page of the New York Times on the thing that everybody was carrying. It's really, really creepy. All sorts of things that didn't happen. I mean, it was very emotional. And suddenly, by shifting the focus, I became a very emotional writer. I became a very political writer. I became a writer of elegy, right? Just because of the choice of the frame moved from the mundane to the emotional. And I thought, you know, you can be any, you know, if you're a recopier like I am, you can become any kind of writer that you want. And it was a completely different experience. So when I retype things, I really feel like I'm just inside the text and I'm dancing with the author. You know, it's so beautiful. I should tell the Kerouac thing, right?
Do tell the Kerouac thing, yes.
So she's heard all these stories all week, I'm sorry. But, so I taught at Princeton, and a very famous author who will remain unnamed here teaches there too. She's a very conventional novelist. And all my students one day came in complaining about her giving them an assignment to write up 5 pages in the style of Jack Kerouac, right? Like on the road, like do a beat thing, you know. And of course, these are kids that are just like looking at Instagram and they can't possibly channel it, and they rattled off some crap and then threw it at her. And I said, what a wasted opportunity. What if instead of having to come up with 5 original pages in the style of Jack Kerouac, they retyped 5 pages of Jack Kerouac? Wouldn't they have really understood the style of Kerouac? And I think about the painters who sit in museums. You know, they set up their easels and they copy, and they learn that way. That's cool for painting. Pianists play the Moonlight Sonata to learn how to play. They play Beethoven in order to understand Beethoven. But writers are not allowed to do this. Somehow, if we copy someone else, we get sued for plagiarism. We're unoriginal. And I think that's just so wrong on so many levels. And I just think literature, in 1959, the writer Brian Gysin said that literature is 50 years behind painting. I think today it might be 100 years behind painting. You know, how come I can't read novels that have real glitches in them? You know, like the way my Microsoft Word screen starts to overprint itself, like at the airport. Like, how come I can't buy those books? Why is there very little trace of the technology that we're using in the literature that we're producing? I mean, we're producing it on these incredible machines, and we speak about the machines, but we actually never replicate the error or the horror or the power of that actual glitch inside the thing. And the glitch could become like musique concrète. We look at music. Musique concrète was based on the warping of technology. Technology just seems to lead everywhere, except for in literature. And you know, I'm talking out 2 sides of my mouth. I'm also retyping my library. I'm not just saying, hey man, let's go digital. I'm actually feeling both ways at the same time. And there are different modes. You know, it's just so important during the pandemic to be in paper and off the internet.
Well, you have also so many examples of writers who do experiment with a form. We were talking about Perec earlier, who wrote without the letter E, and there is a trace around this kind of formalist experimentation also within sound poetry, but also within poetry, where somebody actually, the artist and writer Øyvind Falström, did write poems and wanted to do a cut-up technique exactly like Pierre Henry, who is a composer, a concrete composer, or of course Burroughs, who was mentioned earlier today, who would maybe played around in the glitch, so to speak. But if we, the previous speaker, Panashe, she had this wonderful take on the archive, and citing Marie Kondo, the enemy of all enemies, and talking about collecting and not throwing away, but collecting, and the relationship to your own archive, and who are we without our things. And I think back to the archive that you're now also creating with Retyping My Library. It's creating a new archive from your existing archive, and it's a reproduction, but it's also making unique objects. These are unique objects. These are art objects in an edition of one.
Yeah, they're really against the internet, but of course they're completely digital. I mean, sometimes I'll download an EPUB because I don't have the book, and I'll retype that, but it's full of those kind of glitches, because that's where they really exist on pirate editions. All of us have gotten really shitty EPUBs with bad OCR, right? And we go, that's a disaster. Actually, I included all those OCR errors into my typewriting, right? Because that's the weak image. There's a Boris Groys thing, or Hittosteril, speaks about the power of the degraded image, the bootleg. What its power is its accessibility, and what high resolution stands for is, nefarious capitalism, right? I mean, every crypto billionaire has a home cinema with the highest resolution, whereas the rest of us are probably, many of us are still buying DVDs, under the freeway for €1 a piece, or at least downloading files. But the archive is also really part of this. I mean, I have more music that I've downloaded than I'll never be able to listen to in the next 10 lifetimes. I've got more EPUBs than I'm ever going to read. I've got more films. You can't imagine my hard drive full of films, right? So in this way, we've all become archivists. And I've sometimes said that archiving is the new folk art. Right? It's like knitting. It's something we all do unconsciously, and the way that we utilize our artifacts more than engaging with them is actually to maintain them, to back them up, to organize them, to get more. It's this kind of like hoarding that doesn't really hurt anybody. It's kind of, hoarding is often thought of about as a horrible thing. But in this case, like the notion of a BitTorrent, where one file is shattered sometimes into a million little tiny bytes, and everybody feeds each other. I mean, it's a beautiful, almost kind of communist ecosystem in the way that it then materializes, and then you feed someone else. And when I'm in those kind of like mutual file sharing systems, I feel I'm nurturing. Like, oh my God, you're like taking from me. And sometimes I love seeing people upload from my stuff. So in this sense, like archiving in a way, I think if we're really honest with ourselves, our relationship to our cultural artifacts is citational rather than engaged these days. We like to say we read every book. I think mostly we cite the books. Look at the re-gramming, the retweeting, the citationality of something. I like something that I've never even engaged with, but I've heard that author is good, so I'm going to like that thing, or I'm going to retweet it and move on to the next thing. Now, this is not all the time, right? Because, some of us anyway, read novels and read them very closely and love them and are moved by them. But I think we never speak about this other engagement with literature, which is a citational and a referential engagement, as being actually quite powerful, and not ignoring, but actually engaging obliquely in the way that writing has always become more and more compressed over the years, right? So when Twitter arrives, it's 140 characters, and nobody said, "But I want to write 150 characters. This is no fair. I'm not going to use the thing." So we all wrote 140 characters, and we all became Oulipian constraint-based writers, right? Billions of people are suddenly becoming Oulipian. And you're taking a long sentence, and then it's too long, and you're watching your count, and you're cutting it down, and you're chiseling it, and you're trying to get it, and it's exactly right. It's got that thing. I mean, just what the writer does, this kind of heavy editing. It's 140 characters, bang, off it goes, right? At the best of times. Sometimes that can go very badly, as we know. So this is like I feel that like we're reading more than ever. People say, oh, nobody reads anymore. That's not true. All we do is read. We're hooked on these devices that are full of alphanumeric language. And it's not language in a form that we really recognize yet as being properly literary, but all we do is read. People say we have no attention span. I've never seen people so attentive to anything as they are to their devices. They're absolutely glued. So, I think this is my utopian side. I have another dystopian side.
I bet. You can think about your library, which is going to be 1,000 books. You say this is the Kunstnernes display is sort of on the way. It's at 206. And this is going to be your project for the next, I don't know how many years. If you compare it to the future library, which is going to be read by people in 100 years, where do you think your retyped library will be in 100 years?
Well, so there's this great, I was riding the plane over, and it was a late overnight flight to London one time, and I was sitting next to a lute player. Do you know what a lute is? That Renaissance instrument. He was like a Renaissance musician. And he started telling me about the corpus of lute music, And he said, we only have one composer. I said, well, what is that? Why is that? He said, because in the old days, lute music was so common, and it was sold on every street corner, and there were thousands of composers, right? But this one composer decided to make exquisite drawings on every sheet that he did. And while every other lute music got lost, everybody kept these things not for the music, but because of the beautiful drawings on them. And that became the lute musical canon as it went down, right? So, there's something, like what gets preserved and why do certain things get preserved? I mean, on this project, it's clear, these are extraordinarily famous authors whose words, in some cases, are worth, a lot of money, right? Come on, that's going to be really, there could be a great payoff, at the end of this thing. It's probably, who knows, right? I mean, it's in a way you're betting on slightly cynical, maybe betting on posterity. And I think posterity is one thing that really isn't discussed in this project. Like every writer thinks about their posterity, right? This is a dream posterity project that your things are going to be in this library for 100 years, right? And so all of these things are I think, play into our sense of our future selves. And we're speaking a lot about climate change and the great disaster and the post-disaster. Computer bugs can wipe out everything in 1 minute. Neutron bombs. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can possibly happen. But getting back to your question, I think that because of the labor that I've put into these, that they've actually been typed, the drawing, which I'm thinking about that lute player also, and that's sort of probably one of the reasons I'm doing these drawings in them on really nice paper. Like, I don't really know what's going to happen, but I loved, what these guys were saying this morning about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the stumbling into a room that had sort of amazing things in it. I think all writers are thinking about the future library, all artists. And it's horrible because, you leave a mess for your kids, if you're lucky enough to have somebody like your kids to actually care about it. I mean, artist shit is a big burden on the next generation, you know, unless you're...
Potentially.
But, you know, I know so many, you know, I mean, so many artists who aren't successful. And they're not young anymore. And what is going to happen to all this art? All artists do is produce. We overproduce. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So what's going to happen to all of that? And so there's these systems that are like this project that shake out some stuff and do account for posterity. I think the fact that writers' books are in here are going to like help you guys moving forward in a way that, in a similar way that when you're a young artist and your painting sells at Sotheby's for a ridiculous amount of money, even though you don't get a cut of that, it really helps your future self. For the rest of us, we can hope only to be bootlegged. We can only hope that somebody cares enough about our work to bootleg our work and to steal it. Because most artists don't get anything. And so all you artists that feel like, you know, you're angry that somebody has pirated your book or your video or your novel and thrown it on the internet, you should thank those people, because most people don't get any love at all. Most artists get zero. No, most artists would love to be pirated. So you've actually made it if you've been pirated. So maybe we can almost even end with that kind of positive note on bootlegging and
bootlegging
piracy.
and piracy,
Yeah.
and the physical manifestation of this, which can be seen at Kunstnernes Hus until 7th of August. Retyping my library, which is
Typing a library. Let me
I'm
just
sorry,
say
I'm sorry.
something. Can I just say one thing? No, it's good.
Okay.
We have 1 sec?
Maybe
Half a second. Ow, forget it. It's retyping a library.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Kenny.
Thank you so much. Because retyping a library is even bigger than retyping your library. It's I promised you a day where you could ask questions. It hasn't been the time. So for this year, I know you have had a lot of reflections, but we will have 92 more symposia to come. So please bring your questions next year. And I will leave the end of this symposium to Nilas. So we will take a few more minutes to listen to music. But I will say thank you for joining us. It has been a privilege being part of this. And I hope you have gotten some thoughts and reflections that you otherwise wouldn't have had if you didn't come. But Nilas, Peder Nilas Tornevik, his artist name is Nilas. He is Sami, and he is shaped by his own culture, and he has a playful approach to the music you are about to hear.